This is great. Looks like we're ramping up here pretty quick. We've already got several hundred people in, so just going to give it at least another minute here before I start rolling into this, so some more folks can filter in. So just bear with us. All right, it is officially 7 p.m. Central, which is when we're supposed to start this thing. So early bird gets the worm. Got several hundred people in here already, dozens rolling in by the second, actually. So we're going to get this thing started. Let me first just say, if you can, stick around until the very end, because we will be hosting a Q&A from questions that were submitted by many of you during the registration process. And throughout the presentation, you can also submit questions live, and we will do our best to respond throughout the event. We got a couple of guys ready to rock and roll with responses on the live Q&A. And you're going to want to stick around to the very end, because we're going to be giving away 5 different prize packs from our partners at Muddy, Stealth Cam, and Buck Bomb. All right, so let a few more people roll in here, and while that's happening, I'm just going to repeat what I said. We do have a live Q&A going on, and we will be answering a lot of questions at the end from the live Q&A and the questions that were submitted during registration. Plus, we're going to have some people answering the live Q&A live right down there in the chat. And the other thing I'm going to mention again is stick around to the end, because we will be giving away a prize package from our partners at Stealth Cam, Muddy, and Buck Bomb to 5 lucky random folks who stick around to the very end. So without further ado on all that, guys, I'm going to start rolling into this, and I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Josh Dahlke. I'm the content director at Huntstand. So basically, if you see any types of films, videos, articles, social media, or events like this masterclass, all of that stuff is put together by me and our awesome team at Huntstand, including Will Cooper, who's also joining us tonight to help with our live Q&A. Now, Will is the host of our Huntstand podcast, so be sure to subscribe to that if you haven't already on your preferred listening platform. We drop new episodes of the podcast every week, and right now we're running some Field Note Fridays, which are a special shorter version that we run on Fridays. Right now it's focused on the rut, just like this class, so subscribe to the podcast. You're definitely going to enjoy that. And I also want to give Will a shout out, because we just got done wrapping up edits for the final version of a new film that's going to be launching this week, featuring Will's giant Kansas whitetail that he was fortunate to arrow earlier this year. So that'll be dropping later this week. A little spoiler alert on that. Our team also consists of several pro contributors from all over the country, including Mr. Josh Honeycutt, who is with us here tonight to share some wisdom about killing whitetails during the rut. But before I make further introductions, I'd like to give you a quick overview of Huntstand and everything that we have to offer. First and foremost, Huntstand is the #1 hunting and land management app in North America. So what exactly does that mean? Well, it means that more people use Huntstand to plan and execute successful hunts and manage properties than any other service of its sort. We are a map-based platform. We have a mobile app and desktop application. So we offer everything from full-scale mapping and waypoint management for public and private hunting properties to a full suite of tools that you can use to plan your hunts and be more effective in the field. In the Huntstand app, you're going to find a bunch of really useful stuff like detailed weather forecasting, a visual wind map that shows you where your scent will blow hour by hour, distance and area measurement tools, and all sorts of pins to be able to mark up your maps. Now, one of the greatest things about Huntstand is it allows you to collaborate and share your mapping and strategies with your hunting buddies. So You can share entire hunt areas that you have mapped out, like a lease or a hunting club or any kind of shared property. And recently we launched individual map object sharing just 2 weeks ago. So if you want to just share the location of a tree stand or a ground blind, a hunting cabin, any sort of deer sign, boundaries of a food plot, anything that you save to your map as an object, you can do that with the press of a button now. Your friend will get a text message and boom, they'll be able to open the Huntstand app and find whatever it is that you're wanting to share with them. So that's a super handy feature we just launched 2 weeks ago. Along with that new feature launch, we have enhanced our navigational tools big time. So now that little blue dot that you see that shows your current location will also show you what direction you're pointing. We've also got a digital compass built in now, and we've got a digital rangefinder that makes it really easy to just point your phone in any direction, and it shows you exactly how far away you are from different things on the map. So very helpful navigational tools there that just came out 2 weeks ago. And then the last thing I'm going to mention that we dropped with that big feature launch is huge for all of us whitetail hunters out there. We partnered with the Command Pro app. So now if you run a Muddy or Stealth Cam cellular trail camera, you can view all your camera positions and your trail cam images directly on the map in Huntstand. All of us on our team at Huntstand, we run Muddy and Stealth Cams. But if you don't, and you're interested in getting started with some yourself, we are offering a really sweet offer right now to get you rolling on that. So you can get a Muddy Manifest 2.0 cell cam for just $49 right now. It comes with a month of free unlimited photos, and talk about timing with the rut and everybody really trying to get some deer on camera and figure out what's going on out there. So you're going to get that Muddy Manifest 2.0 for $49 with a free month of unlimited photos. It's a crazy deal. And if you're already running Muddy cell cams, you can still take advantage of this offer. So just jump over to gomuddy.com after this event, load up your cart with a Manifest 2.0 camera, and use code HUNTSTAND, all caps, to take advantage of that deal. And we're probably not going to be running it too much longer, so I'd really recommend, if you're interested in that, to take advantage of it ASAP. And if that was too much for you to remember right now, we will be sending a follow-up email to all of you guys who are attending this event tonight. So you'll be able to get the details there and take advantage of that before it's over. Before I turn it over to my man, Brian Murphy, to get into the nitty-gritty of rutting whitetails, I do want to mention the Pro Whitetail membership in Huntstand. I'm sure many of you already have Pro Whitetail. You've been using it religiously, but either way, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of why you should have it if you are a whitetail hunter. So Huntstand Pro Whitetail, in a nutshell, has all the features that you're going to find in the free version of Huntstand, plus all the features of a pro membership in Huntstand, like monthly satellite imaging and the nationwide property information, where you can see property boundaries and get landowner information for all the states. But then it also has some super specific features specifically for whitetail hunting. Namely, thanks to the team led by Brian Murphy, we have the very first ever nationwide whitetail rut map. Now, this map breaks down all the key phases of the whitetail rut by specific dates on a county level. So we're not talking about statewide or a regional estimate. We're talking about like down to individual deer herds. It's the first rut map to cover the entire country with these dates. And an incredible amount of work went into this to ensure its accuracy. Also in Pro Whitetail, we have the whitetail activity forecast. I can tell you that in our registrations for tonight, a ton of you submitted questions about when is the rut timing in your neighborhood, or what are the best times to hunt during the rut? Well, our rut map and whitetail activity forecast are the answers to those questions. We can say without a doubt that we have the most accurate rut dates and predictive tool for whitetail movements, period, out of any hunting app or tool in the industry. The rut dates in our rut map and the algorithm that drives our whitetail activity forecast are based on pure research and science. So this isn't just hearsay or wives' tales or stuff like that. Like, it's the real deal. And that was a huge effort led by Brian Murphy, who will be coming up next year. When you tap into that whitetail activity forecast, you're going to see a 7-day forecast for whitetail movement with an overall score for each day, and also peak AM and PM movement times. So if you're wondering when the best time is to go deer hunting, use this tool, use the Whitetail Activity Forecast. It launched last fall, and collectively, our team has spent hundreds of days in the field using this. And I can tell you that it's freaky accurate. It's unbelievably accurate, to the point where personally, I have a hard time even going deer hunting on days where we don't have a good score, because I just know that I'm probably not going to see deer. So there's a lot more to offer in the Huntstand Pro Whitetail membership, but we're going to get moving with tonight's presentation. So if you want to learn more about it, head over to huntstand.com and you will see everything you need to know about Pro Whitetail. We've got articles, videos, and a bunch of other content to show you what that's all about. Our expert guests tonight include Josh Honeycutt. So Josh is one of our pro contributors at Huntstand. You will see a ton of his work published in the field notes section of our website, on YouTube, and throughout social media. He's also a contributor to several national hunting publications, so you'll see his byline on articles in just about any hunting magazine you open at any time of year. He is going to cover rut hunting strategies, but first, I want to welcome Brian Murphy. He's our staff biologist and one of the foremost whitetail experts in North America. So Brian's going to kick this thing off with some super cool, interesting, intriguing whitetail biology, so all of us here can get a lot better understanding of what actually drives the rut. So I'm going to kick it over to Mr. Brian Murphy right now.
Thank you, Josh, and thanks to everyone that's on the presentation tonight. I know you're taking time out of your busy schedules to join us, and I certainly hope you pick up some nuggets. As Josh pointed out, I've dedicated my life to whitetails. Decided at a very young age I wanted to study whitetails and learn all I possibly could. Not just because I have a fascination with whitetails as kind of a biologist, but I'm a hardcore hunter, just like probably everybody on this call tonight. So this comes, the data I'm going to present tonight really comes from a scientific perspective, kind of tell you what the ins and the outs of the whitetail rut are, and some of the intriguing sort of details that we have uncovered. After which Josh Honeycutt will kind of take it from there and kind of lay out the hunting strategies associated with that. So with that, we'll dive right in. All right, what is the rut? And a lot of people, when you ask that question, they're thinking very specifically of the time they see bucks chasing or perhaps breeding does. And that's certainly a part of the rut, but the rut is a very long period of time. It's technically, the entire sort of period of the season during which bucks are sexually interested, which is a long part of the year. But by definition, the rut is simply the annual recurring period of increased sexual activity in deer during which breeding occurs. So it's the period of the year that deer breed. Again, we'll talk about specific phases of the rut, like the peak of the rut that most hunters associate with that in just a few minutes. But this period is mostly observed by hunters, at least as it relates to male deer behavior changes, and some of those are rubbing, of course, scraping, seeking receptive does, chasing them, vocalizing, courting. You could include sparring. You could include fighting. You could include tending receptive does. You could include bucks dropping their guard and just doing very, very stupid things at times. But I want to, again, just stress the fact that it's a broad period of the year with very distinct phases, and each has its own very specific purpose to ensure timely reproduction and sustainability of the species, which has been on this continent now for about 2 million years. So they're doing something right. Next slide, please. So how do biologists determine, or even hunters determine, the timing of the rut? And there are a number of methods used. And Josh Dahlke, mentioned the whitetail rut map that I put together a little over a year ago. And I had to reach out to every single state wildlife agency biologist across the country, obtain their data, which came in a number of different forms. But the gold standard by far is measuring fetuses that are pulled from pregnant does. And the picture there in the slide indicates the process. That scale, which hunters can buy, you can go online and buy one. It's actually created by one of my best friends and mentors, Mr. Joe Hamilton, who founded the Quality Deer Management Association. He created that. And basically all you have to do is lay a fetus on that scale. It will tell you how many days old that fetus is at the day that the doe was harvested, of course. You can subtract that number of days and you can determine the exact day the doe bred. And if you do that for a number of does harvested with fetuses during the hunting season, you can plot your own rut. And by far, that's the most accurate, almost indisputable way to determine when the rut is. Other ways, sometimes scientists may be doing some research projects where they have transmitters inside of pregnant does that are expelled at the time the fawns are born. They send off a signal so the researchers can go in there and find those fawns the very day that they're born. And we do kind of a reverse process there. We simply subtract the pregnancy period, or gestation period as it's called, which is about 195 days from the date of that fawn being dropped on the ground. And that also gives us the day the doe would have conceived. So those are kind of the two best standards, but sometimes we don't have that in every area. And believe it or not, there's been some pretty good, compelling research that has shown a very strong correlation between car collision peaks during the breeding season, as well as when adult bucks are most commonly harvested. So sometimes we have to back our way into a sort of an educated best guess, but again, by far the two most reliable methods are fetal measurements and parturition dates. One thing that keeps coming up among hunters that I see in chats and sometimes even the questions I get personally is the impact on the moon on breeding date and whitetails. And I can tell you without hesitation that there have been dozens, and I underline dozens and dozens of studies from Canada to South Florida to South Texas and every part in between. And of course, we can look at the date the fawns or the does conceived and look at what the moon phase was. And there's been no evidence whatsoever that the moon has any impact at all on when does become pregnant or come into estrus. That's not necessarily saying, and we can talk about that a little later, that the moon doesn't have any impact on deer movement, but there's clearly no evidence whatsoever that moon affects breeding dates in whitetails. And that makes sense. The moon can, the phase of the moon can change considerably, every October, November. It can be weeks apart in terms of full moons or dark moons. And if whitetails were chasing a moon phase, their fawns would be hitting the ground at all kind of random times throughout, each year. And that just does not make sort of biological sense over the long haul. So they need something a lot more reliable to go on than moon phase. So what does impact the rut? And I can say it's a very complex set of things that impact the rut. There are a number of factors involved, and it does vary considerably where you are in the whitetails range. Throughout most of the country, and when I say most of the country, if you kind of look at the mid states and north and east, so everything from sort of lower central states like Oklahoma, Tennessee, North Carolina, everything north of that line, it's very clearly a photo period or day length triggered phenomenon. It has to be. Those deer herds have to breed at that time for those fawns to be born when they should, so that they can survive their first winter. And so as day length begins to shorten in autumn, it actually triggers a response through the deer's optic nerve in their eye. Of course, they don't know this is going on, but it stimulates the production of melatonin. And melatonin then has a chain reaction on the deer's reproductive organs and basically increases the deer's sexual drive and breeding readiness. And to some extent, bucks are primed a little bit ahead of the does, which makes sense. They need to be ready before the first doe comes into heat. However, if you're in south of that line I mentioned, and again, if you kind of draw a line from Oklahoma to North Carolina, south of that line, a number of other things come into play. And frankly, we don't fully understand all the different influences here. However, in those areas, we see a wide variation in rut dates. Certainly photo period is involved, no question. But we also see localized environmental conditions, things like, late spring floods, habitat conditions. It appears that deer herds have, in those southern latitudes, have the ability to customize their breeding dates to some extent. Also, we see a strong influence in some areas of stalking source, and that is back when whitetail herds were nearly wiped out across North America. We went and got deer where they existed and put them in places they didn't. And so many of the herds we hunt today had origins from multiple states, deer herds originally. We still see a strong genetic or stalking influence in some of those areas. However, it gets pretty interesting as you move towards the equator. And as you get further south in North America towards the equator, we see photo period becoming less and less of a driving force. And here we see very wide ranges in rut dates. In fact, we see 210 days, 7 months of variation in rut dates across the South, compared to only about 45 days in the northern half of the U.S. and all of Canada. So we see very little difference in the northern part of the whitetails range, but in the south we see quite a difference. And that holds true as you move towards the equator. We see with any deer species, it's not uncommon. Whitetails do extend all the way down into northern South America. We see other populations of deer near the equator, a lot of axis deer around the world and so forth. It's not uncommon to see those herds at various stages of breeding, hard antler, fawning, soft antler at any time of the year. Habitat conditions are nearly equal year round near the equator, so there's no sort of driving force to force those deer herds to breed at a particular time. So let's talk to the 5 rut. And there's a lot of sort of carryover between one phase to the other, but just for simplicity purposes, we'll break it into the 5 main phases. And the pre-rut period actually begins much earlier than most hunters would probably believe, because it happens literally from the last week or two of velvet antler. In other words, right before they shed their antler, the rut for them actually starts, because they see a huge spike in the male hormone testosterone that occurs in most areas in late August, not everywhere, but most areas late August. And this absolutely causes the final mineralization of the antler. It causes them to shed their velvet. It causes them to break up those bachelor groups that they've been in all summer, increases aggression among bucks. You see some breaking up of those bachelor groups, with some of the bucks staying local and others traveling back to their fall or breeding home range, which can be 1 or 2 miles away in some cases. So this early sort of pre-rut phase has a wide window. So it starts with velvet removal and early rubbing and then ultimately scraping and sparring. Bucks are fertile actually from the last couple of weeks of velvet antler. A lot of hunters don't realize this, but a buck is actually fertile just about the time they're shedding their velvet, if not a few days before that. And in fact, they remain fertile until about a week or two after they cast their antlers. So for a buck, that's technically the rut for a buck, is anytime he's fertile, which again is from the last few days before velvet removal on their antlers and a week or so after they cast their antlers. But of course, does aren't in estrus at this period. And again, that's Mother Nature's way of getting the bucks ready ahead of time. They're preparing for breeding. They're topping up their fat reserves because they're going to lose somewhere between 20 and 30% of their body weight during the rut. So they're really kind of in that last stage of just starting to kind of, feel their oats, put on that last little bit of fat. And then they start to obviously experience swelling. The neck, shoulders, and genitalia of bucks are highly sensitive to testosterone, so they get swelling and increased vigor there. So they're just really getting into the mood. And the whole purpose of the pre-rut is for bucks to advertise their presence primarily to does, so that they're ready when the does come into estrus, but also to tell the other bucks in the area who's there. It's kind of a chance to really kind of sort out to some extent the pecking order even before the rut occurs, by who's leaving their scents at scrapes and signpost rubs and that sort of thing. The last phase, the pre-rut's probably my favorite time of the entire year in the whitetail woods. That seeking phase, when those bucks are on their feet, looking for that first or second hot doe of the season. And interestingly enough, research has shown that bucks actually spend more time in daylight hours during the final stages of the pre-rut than they actually do during the rut itself. So the most visible time of most bucks is going to be at the later stages of the pre-rut. So again, perhaps my favorite time of all to hunt whitetails. All right, the peak rut. This is obviously the most exciting time for many of us, but it also can be a very frustrating time. This is the period during which most does will conceive, most breeding occurs. And if you are fortunate to have a managed deer herd, and when I say that, I mean adequate buck age structure, at least some 3- and 4-year-olds on the landscape, decent sex ratios. In such herds, you can reasonably expect about 50%, sometimes 60 or even 70% of your does to breed during a 2-week period. And biologists consider that sort of peak, 50% breeding, to be the quote peak of the rut. Is not necessarily when hunters see the peak of activity, because of a very clear reason. When a buck finds a receptive doe, they typically will try to stay with that doe anywhere from 24 to 36 hours, unless they're kicked off of that doe by a more aggressive, more mature buck. But if they're allowed to hang with that doe during that receptive time, he will continue to breed her, but he'll also try to protect her from other bucks. And the primary strategy is to take that doe into heavy cover and just kind of hunker down. So hunters often see that sort of lockdown phase because bucks are with does. And when you have plenty of does out there, of course, bucks can quickly get from one hot doe to the next if there's not a lot of competition among bucks. So a lot of hunters don't see a lot of daytime activity because they may have too few bucks relative to the does. And of course, the bucks can quickly move from one to the other during that peak breeding period. It is the time during which sort of these true significant battles can occur. Obviously, aggression, testosterone levels are at their peak. In most cases, whitetails don't do a lot of true knockdown, drag out fights. They do occur, of course, but most of that's really kind of sorted out during other periods of the year through some posturing and other things, but it certainly can occur. And researchers believe that in most cases, that's when bucks that don't know each other very well, in other words, perhaps on the edges of two overlapping home ranges, the bucks may not have kind of worked out who's boss beforehand. And when that rival buck enters, sometimes these true knockdown dragouts can occur. And I've been privy to a few of those. In fact, in the middle of one as a graduate student one time. And they're quite impressive for sure. But that is a great time for you to pull out your rattling antlers and your calls and get aggressive in your tactics, because bucks are responsive to those techniques during that period. However, one thing that is worth noting is that scrapes and rubs typically go quite cold during the peak of the rut. And that's because bucks are more worried about being with receptive does than marking, the trees and scrape sites. So I would say avoid, a focus on rubs and scrapes at that time, and really focus on getting where you can perhaps encounter a buck next to heavy cover. So if any word of advice, and I'm sure Josh Honeycutt will touch on that, is during that sort of lockdown phase, move in heavier, closer to the bedding cover, because that's more likely where these deer are going to be. The waning rut. This can also be a fun time. And this is kind of the back end, if you will, the back side of the peak of the rut. Main part of the rut has ended. And so you're seeing this sort of declining level of receptive does during that period. Bucks are still eager. They're still on the move. They're still looking, but generally about 3 weeks following the peak of the rut, you have this lull. Somewhere between 2 and 3 weeks after the peak, you hit this kind of low spot. The does are pretty much, the first cycle does are pretty well done. They're either bred or are going to cycle again in the second rut, which we'll talk about, or, there's just kind of this sort of quiet period. But because bucks are still interested, again, calling and rattling can be quite effective during that period, sometimes even more. I find actually the response I get personally is better during the pre-rut and waning rut with rattling and calling than I actually get during the peak of the rut itself. Because these bucks are trying to stay in the game, waiting for this so-called second rut, which I'll talk about next. So I hear a lot of hunters talking about the so-called second rut, and there's also, I think, some confusion as to what it really is. And because there are kind of two different things happening here. In most deer herds, if you have any decent buck age structure and somewhat balanced sex ratios, you don't have a high percentage of your adult does coming back into heat a second time because they were bred the first time. And the estrus cycle in whitetails is roughly 28 to 30 days. So if you know the peak of the rut, you can add essentially a month to that, and you can pretty well define when your second rut will occur. Because a doe only has 24 to 36 hours to breed once a month. So if they missed it during the first breeding cycle, they have to wait a full month before they can cycle again. And so you can kind of pinpoint the date on the calendar that you've got a chance for it. It won't be as pronounced as the first rut. In fact, if your herd is very well managed, it shouldn't be very pronounced at all. However, you can certainly see some activity during this time. The other thing that's occurring here is that it's not uncommon for first-time breeding does, and I'm talking about fawn does and yearling does, 1.5-year-olds and 6-month-old fawns. It's not uncommon for them to cycle later their first time. So sometimes they don't cycle during that sort of earlier peak rut period, and they have to kind of wait a little longer. So a lot of those fawns, if you have any fawns breeding in your area, and certainly a lot of 18-month-old does will enter their first estrus cycle during that so-called second rut period. So it's not as pronounced as the first rut, but can be a very good time to pick up a buck moving, because bucks are having to move more at that time to find a receptive doe because there's fewer of them. So bucks actually can be quite visible during the second rut because there's not as many hot does, and you'll certainly see more interest by those bucks in the younger does out in the fields because they're the ones more likely to be entering estrus. One thing also to keep in mind there when it comes to your fawn is throughout much of the whitetails range, we don't see a lot of fawn breeding. And again, these are fawns born in the summer and breeding and conceiving their first fall at 6 months of age. In most cases, we need to see a doe fawn reach a critical threshold body weight of somewhere between 60 and 65 pounds. They often can't do that during the peak first rut, but they can often by the second or even after the second rut. So those fawns can actually be the sort of the quote bait for the bucks later in the season. In the deep south, we don't have a high percentage of fawn breeding. Our doe fawns just don't quite get there in time. However, if you're in the central U.S., the Midwest, the ag belt, you can sometimes see 30, 40, 50% of your fawns breeding in their first fall, and they will almost always be later in the season. And so if you have some good family groups of a lot of doe fawns, I would definitely be hunting them come the second rut and beyond. All right, to post rut. This is also a period that's got a very long tail to it because, again, bucks, they remain interested, not as aggressive and don't work as hard, but they remain interested until basically almost their antlers fall off and they go into that sort of next year's cycle. So bucks are still going to be interested, but what starts to take over there is the need to eat. They've lost so much body weight and condition. The number of receptive does is trickling down to a very, very low level. And so they really shift to a more of a driven by their stomachs than by their need to breed at that point. So you see a real rapid shift, generally about 2 or 3 weeks following the second rut, to where there's very little chasing or breeding left over, and it's really kind of a time for bucks to get out there and eat. And if there happens to be a hot doe very late in the season, of course they'll service that doe. But in most cases, they're going to be looking for high carbohydrate, high energy sources. This is not a time of year bucks need high protein. So they need energy, carbohydrates, things like, corn, soybeans, those sorts of things, high energy foods, quite good. Acorns, if there's any left, often there's not that late, but it does make bucks very vulnerable at that time. They have to feed. So, if you can handle the cold winter conditions, one of my favorite times to hunt the Midwest is during that late season. And bucks are fairly predictable at that time in terms of coming to food sources. All right, let's talk about variation. I alluded to it a little earlier, and the little table that I've included here is kind of from some of the research that I did putting together that rut map. And it just kind of allowed me, it was given that there was 210 days of variation, 7 months of variation in whitetail breeding across the U.S. And I can say that I'm not aware of a single other large species that has the variation in breeding dates that a whitetail does. Just another reason they're so intriguing. So with 210 days, I just simply divided, into 3 70-day periods and created those herds that I would call the early rut herds, the traditional rut herds, and the late rut herds. And you can read for yourself on the screen there the date ranges that I used to break those down. So the early rut herds, I classed as those from, July, basically late July to the end of September. And there was 119 counties in the U.S. that had, an early rut. If you looked at the traditional rut, which would be an October, November rut, essentially here, of course, the vast majority of counties, in fact, about 2/3 of all counties in the entire country had a rut during this period. Again, not surprising. And if you look at the late rut, this was probably the one that intrigued me the most. Certainly, I was aware of a lot of late rutting herds, but I was not aware that there were nearly 767 counties, almost 18% of the whitetails range, that had their peak ruts after the 10th of December, which is a pretty significant number of herds and counties that do offer this. And if you look at those states to the far right, it won't surprise you. All of them are in the deep South, where, again, photoperiod is not as significant a driving force. So that we see a lot of variation there among those deep southern states. I would say the one that stands out to me personally is North Carolina. North Carolina is a little far north to have as much variation as the rest of the southern belt has, particularly because South Carolina doesn't show that same variation, and yet it does. So some interesting things going on there for sure. But the take-home kind of message here is that if you're in the northern half of the United States, again, I mentioned the line roughly from Oklahoma to North Carolina. If you're above that line, north of that line, all the way into Canada, you're going to have an October-November rut with almost no exceptions. There's a few, but there's not many. So you don't have a lot of sort of variation there. So you can kind of set your calendars and be pretty consistent. South of this line, again, we see a considerable variation. In fact, we have ruts occurring in 9 calendar months of the year, 210 days, 7 months of variation, but they occur across parts of 9 calendar months. So something I kind of jokingly challenged our team to do is create a new category of the Whitetail Rut Slam, and how many people can harvest perhaps as many as 6 bucks in a single season during the rut in different areas. It'd be kind of a fun, intriguing little thing to do. I don't know that anybody's ever done that kind of chase the whitetail rut for better part of 9 months. Kind of pretty cool. Again, November is the rut king. Of course, November's good almost in every state. There's somewhere in every state where you can hunt a November rut, which is great. Not surprising, both the earliest and latest rut start dates were in Florida. And again, it's our most southerly state. Perhaps part of South Texas would challenge that. But it's also the only state in which we had a rut in all 9 calendar months. So by far the most variable state in the country is Florida. So it certainly stands out in terms of being quite unique there. But if you just want to look at a late season hunt, there's no question that Mississippi and Alabama are your states. Vast majority of the ruts in both of those states occur in December, January. So if you're looking for a late rut hunt, I would definitely be looking at Mississippi and Alabama for sure. All right, a couple of just kind of gee whiz things that I get a lot of questions on occasionally. Is just some of the things that relate to the rut here. And I hear often that, hunters found a buck's rub line or a buck's scrape line. Certainly a single buck can dominate a particular rub or scrape line, no question. However, in the vast majority of cases, and research has shown this over and over, we're seeing multiple bucks using scrapes in a given area, and many often using some of the same rubs, particularly those larger traditional signpost type rubs. So don't be, confused that a line of scrapes or a line of rubs is a single buck, because in most cases, it's simply not the case. Also, young bucks don't do a lot of scraping. They certainly will scrape, but it does take experience from what we can tell. It's kind of a learned thing. They innately kind of have the basics, but if you watch a 1.5-year-old buck make his first or second scrape, he's pretty awkward at it. They certainly get better with experience. And research has shown that these youngsters only make about 15% of the scrapes that you may find. However, they make about half the rubs. So they certainly know a little more about rubbing as young bucks than they do about scraping. But it's kind of an interesting thing there. The average buck, based on research, is going to make about 300 to 400 rubs per year. Research has shown that mature bucks, and I'm talking about 4.5 plus, can make 1,000 or more. A lot more than we think, but researchers have sent students out there and counted these darn things, and we actually show a lot more rubs than hunters probably realize. There's a lot of theories out there. Does a big buck rub a little tree, or vice versa? Fact is, if I can put a climbing deer stand on a rub tree, it's a mature buck. I can pretty well tell you that you're not seeing 1.5-year-old and 2-year-olds, with very few exceptions, making rubs on very large thigh-sized trees. However, a small rub doesn't mean a whole lot. I've certainly seen very large bucks make rubs on saplings. So little common sense here. With scrapes, a lot of hunters certainly enamored by scrapes. Great place to put trail cameras up, learn a lot about who's in the area. Mock scrapes are a big deal, and I certainly advocate those in many areas. But most scrape activity does occur at night. So in most cases, they're not the best places to hunt during daylight hours. Of course, that's when we hunt. But they can be useful in learning how to kill a buck on the way to a scrape. So I always tell hunters to use trail cameras to triangulate where that buck's coming from, likely where he's bedding, and then try to intercept him, 100 yards or 75 yards from those scrape sites on his way to them. Often they'll arrive just after the end of shooting hours in the evening. So try to get them that 15 minutes earlier, 75 yards away. One thing also is that the scrapes, I mentioned it earlier, Scrapes reach their peak and their hottest during the pre-rut period, late pre-rut period, but about 7 to 14 days from when does will start hitting their peak estrus, those scrapes will go cold. So scrapes, when the scrapes go cold, that's a good indicator that does are starting to come into estrus. So when bucks quit scraping, just as the rut part of the season enters, the transition from the pre-rut to the rut, when those scrapes go cold, that's when it's time to start looking for those receptive does because the breeding has started on your property. I want to also just kind of share an anecdotal thing about the importance of the licking branch at a scrape. And certainly a lot of hunters that make mock scrapes or that monitor scrapes regularly with trail cams know this. But the photo in the bottom of the screen there shows a buck. He had his antlers cut off, but it was a 3-year-old buck. And he was one of my research bucks at the University of Georgia when I was doing my graduate research many years ago. And he was put into pens with a couple of does that had different scent treatments on them, estrus urine, estrus vaginal secretions, a number of things that would give the chemical signals to the buck that she might be in heat, but yet they weren't. So he became frustrated pretty regularly, and I could tell he wanted to scrape. I could see him want to, but there was nothing in that pen. No trees, no scrape sites. As you can see in the background, it was just a pen with some black, material around it. And finally, one day I just got on a whim. I thought, I'm going to toss a stick in there and see what he'll do with it. And so I tossed that branch that you see in his mouth into that pen, and he immediately picked it up like a dog with a bone and would literally carry it around until he wanted to make a scrape and then hold it up in the air just as if he was marking an overhanging branch, and then paw the ground and then create the scrape and drop the stick and then go do whatever he's going to do until he wanted to scrape again. And he'd find the stick again like a dog looking for a bone, and then he'd go through the process again. But what that did is it really reinforced the importance of that licking branch. We believe they're leaving saliva, perhaps some nasal gland secretions, maybe forehead gland. We don't know all the scent deposits there, but certainly it's a very important process or part of that scrape sequence. So if you're looking for scrape sites, if you're making mock scrapes, don't underestimate the value of that overhanging branch. All right, wrap it up here. I get a lot of questions about why hunters don't see a clearly defined rut on their property. And I mentioned it earlier that typically in almost every case, there's either a lack of mature bucks in the herd or an unbalanced sex ratio heavily favoring does. So if your deer herd's out of whack, you're probably not going to see a very defined rut. What you typically see is what we call a trickle rut, where there's a little bit of activity here, a little there. But what that also does is it compounds and complicates your fawn drop sequence, because Mother Nature has intended for deer herds to be tuned up and for does to cycle and breed in very tight clusters and then to fawn in tight clusters. But when you have this trickle extended rut, then you have breeding occurring over a long period of the autumn. You have a long strung out fawn drop consequently later that next spring and summer. And what that does is two things. One, it puts those fawns on the ground, many of them a lot later than they should be. It also extends their vulnerability to coyotes and other predators, because you're feeding deer over a long period of the year. Instead of putting all of them on the ground at once and letting the coyotes or bears get a few of them and the rest get away, you're feeding them over an extended time. So you're going to lose a lot more fawns under that scenario than you would under a tight rut, tight fawn drop scenario. The other thing is that many of those late born fawns, regardless of their genetic potential, will never catch up with their earlier born counterparts or cohorts born the same year. So you're putting those young bucks at a huge disadvantage by putting them on the ground late and exposing them to poor nutrition, higher predation, etc. Also kind of interesting is that during this peak estrus period when bucks are with does, again, they're going to breed multiple times. What we've found through research, a number of studies now have documented this, that about 25% of all sets of twin fawns or fawns aren't actually twins in the sense of the word. They actually have two different fathers. We call it multiple paternity. And that's because a doe will be receptive to bucks, during that 24 to 36 hour heat period. And it's not uncommon for her to breed with more than one buck, and therefore to inseminate one of her two ovaries. She has a uterus with two ovaries one in each horn of the uterus. And so it's not uncommon. What's interesting is there's been one case, Auburn University documented a case of triple paternity, triplets with three different fathers. So set of twins ain't always a set of twins, as they say. Next, and this one also has caused a lot of confusion with deer hunters over the years, because they see bucks do what we call a fleeman or lip curl behavior. And that's what the buck's doing in the top photo. Well, they'll encounter doe urine almost always during the breeding season, and they'll perform this lip curl, this head up, scrunch nose, vacuuming effect into the nose. And so for many years, hunters and even researchers believe that that's probably how a buck determines a doe's in heat. However, as I learned in graduate school, sometimes science can get in the way of a good story. And that's what we have here, because researchers at the University of Georgia later looked at the pathway from this organ, and this arrow at the bottom photo is pointing to a little pit in the roof of a buck's mouth. And that's an entry into the deer's true sixth sense. Yes, deer have a sixth sense, but it's not able to spot you 20 foot up a tree with the wind in your favor. It's the sixth sense in the roof of their mouth, called the vomeral nasal organ, or VNO. And that organ is specifically designed for urine analysis by deer. However, it goes to a part of the deer's brain that does not control immediate behavior. It can't. However, it does access a part of the brain that stimulates reproductive organ stimulation. And so we believe that all the evidence supports the fact that a buck isn't determining a doe's estrus status while he's doing this. However, he is getting primed and sexually pumped up, and we equate that to a deer taking a daily Viagra, if you will. Another kind of interesting thing, hunters believe often that these mature bucks will greatly expand their home ranges during the breeding season and just travel everywhere and kick tail and breed every doe in the county. Again, that's not true. What we do see, though, is bucks using a larger part of their home range during the rut. And so we see rut or home range contraction, shrinkage of the use of their home range during spring and summer when resources are good. We see expansion of that, not expansion of the home range, but expansion of use of their home range during the pre-rut and rut periods. So you're not seeing as much, a buck's, greatly changing their home range, but we do see a wider use of that. In fact, that makes them harder to kill during the peak of the rut because they're not using just their core area any longer. They're using almost their entire home range. So it makes them a little more difficult to pattern when they're actually using that. One thing we also have learned in recent years is that about 70% of adult bucks will make at least one excursion during the breeding season. And an excursion is defined as a 1 mile or more movement, short-term movements. These are quick out and back movements outside of their established home range. Sometimes they can go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 miles. They typically stay somewhere between 12 and 36 hours and then return home. We would speculate that they're looking for receptive does. However, they don't just make these excursions during the breeding season. So there may be something else going on there, but certainly those excursions that do occur during the breeding season are probably in search of estrus does. They also can help explain how a sort of mystery buck just shows up quickly on camera, or somebody gets a look at one, or maybe harvests a buck that there's no trail camera photos anywhere around there of that buck, and all of a sudden here he is. He literally could have been making an excursion that may have been a one-time movement the entire hunting season. And he's now a mile away from home for 12 hours, and then he's heading back the next day, and bingo, somebody shoots him. That certainly helps explain some of these mystery bucks that can just randomly show up in various places. So with that, that's kind of a quick primer on the sort of biology of the rut. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to our next presenter, who's already been introduced, Mr. Josh Honeycutt.
Hey guys, I think everybody can hear me and see me. If not, I'm sure we'll find out soon enough. But I just want to thank everybody here, Mr. Dalkey, obviously Mr. Murphy. He's an icon in the industry, a wealth of knowledge. He's forgotten more about whitetails than I'll ever know. So tough act to follow, but I'm going to do my best to keep the train rolling here. And hopefully you guys can maybe pull a few nuggets that you weren't already aware of, or maybe you've forgotten it, and it can be something useful for you this fall. So we're looking here when you're getting into the rut, how do you know that the rut's going on? Obviously, Mr. Murphy's already talked about that. The nationwide rut map in Huntstand Pro Whitetail is incredible for figuring out exactly what's going on in your area and when it happens. So all of those phases are broken down for your specific county. But obviously there's things that we can see in the field that are telltale signs that the rut's really going on. So doe estrus signs to recognize. What are some of those? Now, these aren't always foolproof, so I don't want to say that just because you see one of these things that it's obviously an estrus. But if you see a lot of these things all at once, or in one doe doing these things all at the same time, it's maybe a pretty good sign that there might be a mature buck nearby if you don't see it already. So sometimes when does are in estrus, they'll have their tails straight out, kind of sticking out flat. Sometimes they'll be squatting a lot, urinating quite a bit. You know, estrus bleats in my experience aren't super common, but I've heard other people who say that they hear estrus bleeding sometimes whenever these does are in estrus. It's not, again, it's not something that I've experienced. Once we get back into the Q&A, I would actually like to, that's a question I have for Mr. Murphy myself. But you know, if a doe is really running hard and you see that her, like if she's running, coming down through the trail and her mouth is hanging open, then there's a pretty good sign that something is chasing her. Maybe it's a mature buck, maybe it's a coyote that's been running her, maybe it's a dog, you know, neighborhood dog that's been running her if they like to chase deer, whatever. But if she's running hard, she's got that tongue hanging out, mouth's open, she's, you know, she's hot, she's trying to catch her breath, there's a decent chance that, you know, she's smelling right to the local deer herd and some of the bucks are after her. And again, obviously that's the last bullet point. But so if you see all of these things or some of these things or even a couple of these things with a particular doe while you're on stand or in the ground blind, that's something you want to keep in your mind, because there could be a mature buck or a target buck, whatever you're after. He might be nearby, or like Mr. Murphy said, one of these deer that are on excursions, they might be nearby too. So when we get into the rut, obviously that's my favorite time to call. I don't do a lot of blind calling, and I'll get into that here in a minute. But I do like to call to deer that I see, deer that I know aren't coming into range on their own organically, if they are not going to make it, or if they're going away from me. But the only time I really like to call, even in that scenario, when I see a deer that I know isn't coming into range, is if I don't think that deer can get downwind of me before I get that shot off. So that's what I'm talking about here. Call at the right time. Just because you see a mature deer and it's the rut doesn't mean you should call. You know, a lot of the times I do, but again, I don't like to do that unless I feel like I have a downwind blocker. For example, which we'll get into that again, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. I'm going to skip around on these as I go. But if there is a bluff that's maybe 20 yards to the you know, downwind of me, or maybe it's a riverbank that the deer can't necessarily get across easily, whatever the case might be, if there is something that's downwind of me that makes it difficult for that buck to circle before I can get a shot off, I tend not to call to the deer, even if I can see them. Once I've made that decision to call, I like to call at the proper volume. Personally, I prefer to start quiet and ramp up, because it's easy to wait 2 seconds, realize the deer didn't hear you, and then call again a little louder. It's really hard to walk back an overly loud grunt. And I'm not saying that an overly loud grunt is going to spook that deer, because if you've spent some time in the woods, and I've only heard it a couple times. I actually had a discussion with Mr. Dalkey today where he heard it, I think, a couple days ago, but what they call a buck roar, it's just a really loud guttural roar. So I'm not saying that you're going to necessarily spook that deer by calling loudly. But again, if you have a buck that's at 40 yards, 50 yards, and you're trying to get him through the brush, obviously I wouldn't call it a deer that close anyway. But say that deer is just outside of range. Maybe he's, you know, if you're gun hunting, maybe he's 250. If you're bow hunting, maybe he's 100 and you need to get him into 40, whatever the situation is. If you start quiet and then get louder as you need to, you're going to be a lot better off than starting out really loudly. Calling with the right frequency is good too. Again, sometimes in the peak of the rut, when these deer are running hot, they can be very vocal. Even in pressured settings that I've hunted, you know, that's been the case. So it's, you know, a lot of people talk about call shy turkeys, and sometimes people will try to talk about call shy whitetails. But, you know, as far as frequency goes, again, if you're blind calling, I would probably limit your blind calling to once every 20 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe. Everything with whitetail hunting is so situational that you might change that up, or maybe call a little bit more frequently, or wait a little longer, depending on the scenario. But generally for me, when I'm blind calling, every 15 to 20 minutes is usually a good frequency for me. Obviously you want to keep an eye on that wind when you're calling. Winds shift regularly. Another tool in Huntstand is the hunt zone wind indicator. And so winds change throughout the day. And so if you're going to try to figure out, okay, what's that wind going to be doing in within the next hour or in 2 hours, you can just thumb through, and see exactly how that wind's going to shift. And sometimes whitetails don't respond immediately to your call. Sometimes they don't come in for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. They heard you, but they didn't respond. I've actually called to whitetails that I could see at a distance, and they looked at me, flicked that tail, acknowledged that they heard me, turned around and left, and then 3 hours later circled back around. And you want to be, you kind of want to know what that wind is going to do long term, because you might not have that immediate reaction when it comes to trying to call in a deer. Even if you see that deer, forget about blind calling. Even if you see that deer, you might have to wait 2 or 3 hours before you actually get a response from it. Actually, back in 2013, I think it was, I called and rattled to a buck. I wasn't hunting myself, but I was hunting with a friend of mine, and we were hunting together. I called to a deer that we saw, a big mature 150-inch Kentucky buck was running the ridge above us, and grunted at him, snort wheezed at him. I had rattled early in the morning, but I didn't rattle at him in that moment, just grunted and snort wheezed. And he stopped, looked at us, flicked his tail, and kept running the trail that he was on. Well, about 2 hours later, he circled back through at 15 yards. And so keep an eye not only on the current wind direction when you're calling, but also what it's going to be doing over the course of the next few hours. When you're looking at
Hey,
calling,
Josh, I just want to interject for 1 second. Because of the volume of questions that we had that came in prior to this during the registrations regarding calling, it was one of the most requested pieces of information that people wanted you guys to cover. And I know you're covering it in detail, but maybe you and Brian could elaborate a little bit on some of the different vocalizations that deer do make, specifically bucks, just so people can get an idea. Because I know you're mentioning the snort wheeze, and there might be some people on here who aren't familiar with what that is or what we think the reason is that they do that. And frankly, I have personally never been able to hear one myself in my life. And as you mentioned, actually, it was last night that for the second time in my life, I heard that buck roar. I had a mature 8-point that I'm hunting that I got an encounter with, and he did that to me twice last night. And the only other time I've heard it was 3 years ago. It's spine tingling. But when it comes to some vocalizations like that, I think there are a lot of people who never even get to encounter that. So could you guys just quickly cover some of the different types of grunting and vocalizations?
Yeah, I think Brian would be a better person for that than me.
Well, I don't know if I can do it justice, but certainly there's been a number of calls identified in whitetails. Certainly with does and fawns, we have bleats, a lot of communication between fawns and does. Obviously, the can call most simulates a fawn bleat or perhaps a doe bleat. When it comes to bucks, the grunt snort wheeze was mentioned. This is the most aggressive sound that a whitetail buck can make to another buck. When you hear a grunt snort wheeze, when you're a grad student, you climb a fence in a hurry because he's coming at you. He just called me every name in the book, and my mom a couple of names too. And that starts with a grunt, and then it's followed with kind of a, and that is again typically in the presence of other bucks. It is the last straw. Often that's accompanying with what we call piloerection, where they puff up their hair and look dark and menacing. They'll turn sideways to other bucks. That is by far the most aggressive sound. The bawl or bellow or roar, all the same call, is actually a frustration call typically. If a buck is just getting frustrated and he's just really angry and his testosterone levels are up, sometimes we'll hear that bellow or bawl or roar, typically just an aggressive sort of frustration type call. By far the most common call that hunters use is a grunt. And the grunt tubes that we all buy and use, series of low guttural sounds, just typically they're grunting as they're walking. So you kind of have a cadence, a walking type cadence to the call. So you want to kind of do that as Honeycutt talked about, at the right time, the right volume. I almost always have my binoculars right on the deer when I'm blowing the call, so I can see immediately, watch his ears and his eyes. Did I catch him right? Did he hear me? And if he shows no evidence of hearing me at all, then I start ramping up the volume, just as Josh talked about. So the main thing is get their attention. Once you get their attention, you can start to back off. It's kind of like a turkey. If you get their attention, you can start to sit back and watch their behavior. And if they're moving your way, don't screw up and keep calling. Just lay off the call and let their curiosity get to them. But sometimes they'll hang up. I had a big Kentucky buck hang up on me 2 years ago. I was guiding a first-time young lady archer, and we had a giant, a 7.5-year-old, 250-pound Kentucky deer, biggest body deer I'd ever seen in my life on the hoof in Kentucky, come through our food plot by himself during the rut. And I bleated at him. I grunted at him softly, didn't show much interest. But after 2 grunt, snort, wheezes, he bristled up and came into bow range. So that's all it took, is kind of calling his, pulling his man card on him at the right time and place. And sometimes calling won't work. Sometimes if a buck's with a hot doe, sometimes all the calling in the world won't do anything. Why would he leave, a hot doe if he's got what he's looking for already to go get in a fight with another buck, or perhaps look for another doe? But so again, one thing we do know about deer hearing as it relates to calling, the grunt call itself, almost all the modern calls, almost all the frequency or sound that they produce is in the peak sensitivity hearing range of a whitetail. And those are low tonal sounds that actually carry farther in the woods than the higher frequency sounds. So what that means, much like the reason they have a foghorn or a train horn that's very low and guttural in its sound, it's that bellowy sound that comes out of ships and trains for a reason. Those sounds travel farther in the environment than higher frequency sounds. So I say that to say that your grunt call is traveling farther than you think it is in most conditions, obviously high winds notwithstanding. So that's kind of a quick wrap up there. I do often use a fawn bleat, either with my mouth or that, particularly in bow season. Does will often respond very favorably and come into bow range with a fawn bleat. They're just out of curiosity, whether it's their fawn or another fawn. They just have that sort of motherly instinct to come see what's going on to that fawn. So that's another one that can be used, particularly in early archery season.
And for those of you who are eager to hear Brian do his mouth vocalization of that snort wheeze, unfortunately Zoom has this crazy effect where it'll actually cut off the audio when you're making certain sounds. So he got cut off there, but you can find a handful, not too many, but you can find a handful of decent snort wheezes that were recorded on YouTube. And I know that you can find the buck growl or the buck roar on YouTube, because after I heard mine last night, I was trying to share it with some friends who had never heard it before, and I found a really good one. So check YouTube if you want to hear some of those vocalizations. But I'm gonna cut back out here and turn it over to Honeycutt.
Well, I'll make one final comment on that, and then I'll duck off, Josh. But the first time that you hear a buck make a grunt, snort, wheeze, it's a very different sound than you've ever heard in your life, and you actually feel a little stupid making it in the woods sometimes. You're like, what in the world am I doing making this funny sound? But I can assure you, used at the right time and place, it can be absolutely deadly. And I can tell you, the young first-time bow hunter I had in the blind with me that morning when I was making the grunt, snort, wheeze at this giant buck, she looked at me with the most puzzled look on her face, because she didn't have a clue what I was doing. And I didn't have my grunt call with me that morning, so I did it all with my mouth. But it brought him in on a string. And this was a 7-year-old that like I said, I just pulled his card and called him every name in the book, and he couldn't take it. And he had to come right in, and we got a shot at 28 yards on him. So, I would definitely encourage any of you that are interested in hunting mature bucks, particularly I'm talking about 4, 5, 6-year-olds. If you don't know how to make a grunt, snort, wheeze, take the time to watch it online. There are some calls out there that that can do it without having to do it with your voice, but you can also teach your voice to do it and do it on the fly. So I'll leave it with that.
Yeah, thanks, guys. The only other 2 comments I'll make quickly on calling, blind calling specifically, is always look around before you call. There have been some times where I have messed up, and I had been doing series of blind calling, and it was just one of those things where I did not pay good enough attention. I have messed up a couple of times in my life and actually called and already had a deer that was responding, and he was close enough that I didn't realize he was there. It was a really quiet day, wet leaves, couldn't hear him coming, or them coming on those two occasions. And so definitely always do a quick scan before you go with another series of blind calls. Obviously, try to call when you think you might know where deer are coming from. If you're sitting in a spot where deer could come from 360, again, if you don't have those downwind blockers, blind calling is it can get really tough, because almost always my experience is that those deer try to circle downwind. And so if you don't know where that deer is going to come from, or if it could come from every direction, or if it could easily get downwind when you're calling before you get a shot, that can be tough. Moving on to decoying. This is a really fun tactic, and there are plenty of people out there who have more experience with this than myself, but I have done it some, and it's really enjoyable. Those of you who like to turkey hunt, this is like throwing this is like turkey hunting for deer in an instance. But always, again, try to decoy at the right time. Generally, my favorite time to use a decoy is going to be the late pre-rut. So if you're looking at that typical Midwestern, as Mr. Murphy was talking about, if you're looking at the center of the country all the way up to the Midwest, Northeast, that northern half of the country, that October 25th to November 5th period is really my favorite 10-day window. You could even back that up some and do pretty well down around October 20th to 25th. But that October 25th to November 5th, and even beyond that, even when you get up to November 10th, November 15th, I know some people in recent years, just people that I know, are even having some success decoying deer during the late season. I haven't personally seen that, but I have seen them have that success. So decoys can even work during the late season. But I think by and large, the most success historically for most deer hunters has been that October 25th to maybe November 5th or 10th period. Decoy with a good wind, obviously. When a buck sees that decoy, he's going to try to circle downwind of that decoy. Oftentimes, he's also going to circle and meet that buck. If it's a buck decoy, he is going to approach it head on. If he's able to get downwind, he'll go downwind, then approach head on. If it's a doe decoy, oftentimes they'll try to go downwind and then from the rear. That's generally been my experience, and the experience of others who I know are really good decoy experts. So you want to decoy at the right time, decoy with a good wind, decoy in the right areas too. And we'll get, there's a lot to that. We're going to get to here in just a minute, but decoying in the right areas, some properties might not be good for decoying, others might be good for decoying. So you got to be really careful and think about the situation. Some deer herds might not respond well. And the reason I say that is I hunt 4 different properties here in Kentucky, and I've basically used decoys on all of these. There is one property in particular, the decoy, I just never have luck. I don't know. I can't explain it. Again, Mr. Murphy might be able to answer this or have a solution for it. But that particular property, that deer herd, even throughout years, have responded really negatively to decoys. I don't know what it is. Again, whereas other properties that I've used those on have it's been better. And it could have been something subtle that I was overlooking. Maybe my scent was off, or maybe I'd left some ground scent, but it seemed to be a constant theme with that particular deer herd, not over the course of a hunt or 2 hunts, but over the course of years. So it just seems like maybe sometimes deer herds are more receptive to it than others. When you're looking at actual decoy placement, you want to make sure that you decoy in the open. Decoying in the open is for several reasons. Visibility is the first. If a deer can't see your decoy, he's not going to come to your decoy. So decoying in really tight quarters or decoying in really heavy cover, those aren't really good tactics in most cases. Multiple reasons for that. Obviously, visibility is good, but escape routes are important too. Oftentimes, bucks will not approach that decoy if they don't feel like they can escape. So they need to be able to hit the eject button and get out of there if they get their butt whipped, which happens frequently for a lot of deer. So if there's no escape routes, if like they come in head on to that decoy and they don't feel like they have any way out, they're going to be more reluctant to approach it and cause a confrontation. So you want to make sure that deer has a couple of escape routes to get out of there if he gets his butt whipped. Obviously, he's not, because it's a decoy, but he doesn't know that. Obviously, focus on scent control. that deer is going to circle downwind of that decoy. So if you've left a bunch of scent on that by handling it, that's going to be a no bueno situation. You want to make sure that you put that decoy out, keep it in a bag for one. I actually like to, when I first get a decoy, if it's a new decoy, I like to get it out, let it sit out in the sun, let it get rained on, wash it down with some scent reduction soap, spray it down good, whatever you got to do there. And then once that process is taken care of, put it back in the bag. Excuse me. Put it back in the bag and make sure it's in a scent-free environment. Generally, for me, that's outside, keeping it outside, and well away from stinky stuff. Then when you actually deploy that decoy, make sure you're using gloves and wearing rubber boots when you're walking around the location, and then spray it down again after you get it put up. I also like to put some deer scent onto the decoy, because if that deer gets downwind, I mean, deer stink. You all have shot deer during the rut. You know how they smell when you go and you recover your deer. If a deer gets right smack dab nose to nose with a decoy and he doesn't smell anything, that might trigger. It might not, but in my mind anyway, it makes sense. So I try to put some deer scent on that. If it's a doe decoy, I'll put some doe pee or some doe estrus on it. If it's a buck decoy, some buck urine. Real simple there, obviously. Just match it to the decoy that you've got. Decoying with proper orientation, again, very important. Because you're trying to get a shot opportunity. That's the goal, right? So you want to place that decoy in a manner that's going to create that shot opportunity. Multiple things to think about here, obviously. Visibility. You're trying to think about wind. So, and then you also want to make sure that you get that deer oriented correctly in order to get that either broadside or quartering away shot opportunity that you want. So oftentimes, whenever I am placing a decoy, I'm going to place it to where it's quartering toward me. Because that, again, if it's a buck decoy, buck's going to circle, meet it head on. And that, if that decoy is quartering toward me, that means that buck's going to be quartering away. And sometimes they'll kind of sidestep. Sometimes it's not a direct angle. So that's why I don't like to have my decoys perfectly broadside. Sometimes if that decoy is kind of quartering toward me, that buck might kind of angle in. But at worst, he's going to be broadside, and at best, he's going to be quartering away. So when you're placing that buck decoy, have it to where it's quartering to you. It's the exact opposite with doe decoys. I like them quartering away because that buck's going to circle back around from the rear more times than not. So that's really what we're talking about when it comes to orientation. And then decoy with realism. You want to use a realistic deer decoy. You want to make sure that you're adding that scent factor back to it, even though that decoy is scentless. And then you want to make sure that you back up your decoying with calling. You want to set this. It's about selling the scenario, selling the situation, making that as realistic as you can for that deer. And so if you have that, you don't have to call, obviously, as Mr. Murphy was talking about, if he's already committed, don't blow it by calling. But if like you got a deer that sees the decoy and he's maybe 150, 200, 300 yards out, and he's looking at the decoy, but he's not really committed to it, or he's kind of leaving and going the other way, use some calling to entice that deer to try to pull it on into range. So just try to, again, you're observing that deer's behavior, seeing how it's reacting to the situation, which is going to further kind of help you determine what your next step is going to be. Moving, shifting, completely different topic here, different discussion. Hunting traditional rut stands. A lot of different options on the table here. It's going to vary based on the type of terrain that you personally hunt, whether it's swamp, flat swamp ground, all the way up to mountain country. You're going to have different things to focus on depending on the type of terrain that you're going to be hunting in. So some stand locations are going to be habitat based. So we're thinking about food sources, bedding areas, water sources. Some are going to be terrain or topography based, which is change in elevation. So all these that you see here are going to fit into one of those two categories. Those are the two categories that you think about. But no bedding areas, that's the no-brainer, because during the rut, what do we have? We have these bucks that are moving, as long as they don't have an estrus doe currently, they're moving from one doe family group to the next. And these doe family groups, in my experience, tend to be really loyal to the places that they do bed. And so if these mature bucks know where those places are, they're very in tune with their home range, and they know where these doe bed areas, these doe groups tend to be located. So hunting on the downwind sides of doe bedding is really good, because oftentimes those bucks will cruise those downwind sides, scent check in that bedding area to see if there's anything in there. Even better than that, really, is hunting some travel routes and travel corridors that connect multiple doe bedding areas. So it's really, that mentality is very similar to when you're thinking about a bed to feed line of movement. It's really the same concept. You're looking at the line of movement again. That's what we're always trying to do when we're intercepting deer movement, is figuring out what their lines of movement are. What are they thinking about at that particular time, and setting yourself up to intercept that movement. So downwind sides of doe bedding areas, and areas that are basically, you might consider intersections where multiple trails come together that connect multiple bedding areas. That's another one too. Funnels and pinch points, those are the ones that you've heard about your whole life, and they're good. There's a reason for that. I think mature deer in pressured settings tend to catch on to that a little bit more, especially if it's a long way from their buck bedding areas that they feel comfortable in. I see a lot of yearling bucks, 2.5 and 3.5-year-old deer, using these obvious traditional funnels and pinch points that look obvious to us as hunters on maps. But those are the areas that get hit the hardest too, especially during the rut, especially on public land, shared private permission. And so even though your mature bucks are 4.5, 5.5, 6.5+ year-old deer, they'll use those too, but they tend to hit those areas a little bit less if you're hunting a property that receives permission, and again, or receives a lot of pressure. And again, that can be a private or a public piece. Looking at crossings is really good. Creeks, rivers, drainages, anywhere that limits or blocks. We were talking about blockers earlier. Oftentimes, even if you do have a blocker somewhere, there's going to be a crossing there. Oftentimes, it's for rivers and creeks, it's oxbows, where they have those S turns. Oftentimes, or excuse me, if it's an S turn, which is different than oxbow, but if you have an S turn, you're going to have a steep side and a shallow side, but there's going to be a crossing somewhere right there. Oftentimes, those are really good locations in those situations. Prime food sources is really good. Deer how to eat, I mean, I'm thinking about food right now because I haven't had supper yet. So deer are the same way. Bucks do lose a lot of their, as Mr. Murphy said, lose up to 30% of their body weight during the rut because they're running and looking for does so much. But the does are still thinking all about food. And even the bucks are to a degree. And so prime food sources, the best food that's in that area, whether it's ag, natural food sources, food plots, whatever it might be. If you're in a state where you can bait, baited area, whatever the food source is, keep hunting that, because that's where the does are going to be, and the bucks are going to be where the does are. Leeward, these are some others that are a little bit more obscure, but leeward ridges, that's a kind of a term that is basically just a downwind side of a ridge. So if you say you've got a ridge line that runs west to east, and you've got a north wind, the south side of that ridge is going to be the leeward side. And a lot of the times, these deer will hit those benches, and that's on the leeward side again. So like maybe if you're looking at a long ridge line, and it's hill country or mountain country, and you've got, say, a high elevation bench that's 3/4 of the way up, or one that's maybe 1/3 of the way up. In my experience, because I do hunt a lot of hills, especially in Ohio, of a mornings when you have those rising thermals and you've got that prevailing wind that's coming from the north, so it's carrying wind from the north over the top of that ridge, and then you have the thermals that are carrying up from below, that a lot of times these bucks will cruise those ridges, and they can smell and scent check for does of a morning for that whole distance. So they can smell what's down in the bottom, they can smell what's halfway up the ridge, what's down at the lower third of the ridge, and they might even smell what's at the top of the ridge because of that prevailing wind. So it's kind of the opposite in the afternoons, though. So what I have noticed is that in the afternoons, I have seen better cruising activity on lower benches. So maybe there's a bench that's 1/4 of the way up or 1/3 of the way up that ridge, and you have the afternoon thermals that are falling, the temperatures are dropping, and so you're that last 30, 45 minutes, maybe hour of the day, perhaps longer if you're depending on the weather circumstances, you might see those deer cruising those lower level benches, scent checking for does that are up above. And so that's something to keep in mind too. Water is big. Deer drink a lot during the rut, especially bucks that have been running hard. So small, secluded water sources that are close to bedding cover, I have had really good activity there. And then weird spots. And so what I mean by weird spots, and this is something that I didn't really catch on to for a long time, but oftentimes, and it makes sense, these, at least in my experience, these mature deer especially, maybe not so many of the 1.5, 2.5, and maybe even some of the 3.5-year-old bucks, but you know, the 4.5, 5.5, 6.5, 7.5-year-old deer that I've hunted, which I've not hunted a lot of 7.5-year-old deer, but I've had the chance to hunt a few. But those 4.5-plus-year-old bucks, they really seem to try to do their best to push those does, those estrus does that they've found, and that's their gal. They try to push them as far away from the deer herd as they can, and into obscure, weird locations where the rest of the deer herd tends to not be. And so that's going to look different for every property. But, you know, I'm just throwing some anecdotal stuff for the properties that I hunt. I have seen a lot of buck and doe estrus pairs end up in sinkholes around old home places where it's old buildings that are dilapidated. Maybe they're 150 years old, 100 years old, whatever. They're, you know, obviously abandoned. You know, around those, bedded up against them. Maybe it's a little bitty pocket of timber that's out in the middle of a big wide open field that the deer otherwise wouldn't be going to. Whatever the case looks like for your particular property, they're going to be trying to get them to places where the bucks can hide those does from the other deer. And so that's what I'm talking about when it comes to weird spots. And then there's some stand locations to think about if you're hunting really pressured areas. Marshes and swamps. Now, I do some public land hunting and have done in a few different states, and marshes and swamps are just fun. You know, they're fun to hunt. I don't do a lot of that, I'll just be honest, but whenever I've hunted some public lands or, you know, in and outside of the rut, these deer use water as their friend. And I've seen that even on the private land pieces that I hunt that are more water centric, if you will. They use it to their advantage. They use it for security purposes. And some of these places are solid rut stands. So marshes, swamp interiors, maybe if you got a really, really swampy area, you've got some pockets of high ground. I have seen where bucks will push does to those areas to get them away from the deer, to get them away from other hunters. You know, if they're, you know, been pushed around by hunters, they're trying to avoid everybody, hunters and deer alike. So definitely think about pockets of high ground within swampy areas, within marsh ground. Those are good almost all season long, even for mature bucks during the pre-rut and, you know, early season, late season, but they can be really good rut stands too. Pockets of dense native grasses. There's a property that I still hunt, but it was CRP for years. Just came out of the CRP rotation though, unfortunately. It was the best rut farm I've ever hunted. I've been very fortunate to hunt a lot of states. You know, I can't have to think about it to add them all up, but I've hunted in the Midwest, in the Southeast, you know, all the way up to South Dakota, down to South Carolina. And the best rut farm I ever hunted was the CRP farm that I've hunted for years here at home. This year it's in ag. But what I learned from hunting that property in CRP it's probably 7 or 8 years, maybe longer, that I hunted. It was in CRP for longer than that, but the number of years that I got to hunt, CRP is incredible ground for hunting the rut, because a lot of times these bucks will push those does out of the timber, because all the bucks are in the timber looking for does, because that's where a lot of the bedding areas are. But they will push those does out of that timber into the CRP in random locations to get them away from the rest of the deer. So if you can manage your land, I would highly, highly suggest putting some of it in native grasses, not just for that aspect of it, but if you want to have a good rut spot, and you can afford to put anywhere from 10 to 20 to 50 or more acres in native grasses, you're going to see a great, great situation come the rut. That's been my experience anyway. And then obviously young timber stands, high stem counts, deep timber hideouts. If you're way back in the timber, further than other hunters are going to want to go. And then obviously waterlocked areas, places that's very difficult for hunters to reach without boat access. Again, it's all about getting away from the hunters. That's true outside of the rut. It's true inside of the rut. All-day rut hunts is something that we actually just talked about on the Huntstand podcast, me and Mr. Will Cooper. So if you haven't listened to that one, I'm not sure exactly when that drops yet. I think it's this week. You'll have to check that out, and we'll get a lot more detailed information. But leeward ridges, again, I'm talking about that. We're looking for areas that tend to produce really well daylight to dark. Now, an all-day rut hunt can be a morning hunt in one location and then immediately shifting to an afternoon spot that's somewhere else. But if we're just purely talking about sitting in the same stand daylight to dark, leeward ridges is really good. Again, if you've got multiple benches, I would suggest that high level bench of a morning, low level bench of an afternoon. On the edge of doe group bedding areas, as I mentioned, also these bucks are cruising those downwind sides. So doe group bedding areas are going to be great. Again, as well, between 2 or more doe bedding areas. And lastly, don't abandon your best bedding areas that you typically see your bucks bedding during the early season and pre-rut, because oftentimes these uber mature deer, and again, it's gonna be dictated by that deer's personality. Every deer has a drive to breed. In my experience, again, Mr. Murphy would be able to better answer that. But in my experience, almost it seems like just from seeing deer in person, anecdotally, as well as studying trail camera videos, it seems like some deer have a bigger drive. Some bucks have a bigger drive than others. And oftentimes I'm sure those that are higher up on the dominance scale or hierarchy ladder are going to be more apt, and those that are lower are going to be less apt. But for the deer that aren't necessarily running themselves ragged, don't think that they've just suddenly abandoned their bedding areas that they've been loyal to all season long. As long as those bedding areas still serve what they need for them to serve, such as if it's offering them the solar and thermal cover that they need, if it's really cold, if there's nearby food sources, if it's still not been pressured too heavily, if they're still getting everything they need to out of that bedding area. Oftentimes these bucks that are really smart, really mature, they might actually look for doe all night long. If they don't find one by morning, they're back to their own bedding area. I have seen that, because one of the things that I personally like to do is let trail cameras soak in bedding areas. And you can do that with a cell camera that sends it to you real time, or you can do it with a SD camera that you check after deer season when you go in there to shed hunt. But that is something that I've learned with those uber mature deer, and even some of the 3.5 and 4.5-year-olds. This is something that I like to talk about, and it's called the 3-day rut rule. It's not a concept that I came up with. It's something that I just learned about a long time ago.
Honeycutt.
Yes, sir.
I hate to interrupt again, but can you go back to the previous slide? And something I'd like you to just do a little bit deeper dive on would be the concept of hunting the downwind side of doe bedding areas, because that's something that it's probably the most talked about tactic that I see when it comes to rut hunting. But I think a lot of people could use a little bit of more insight on how do you strategically set up on the downwind side of a doe bedding area? Because obviously if a buck is cruising the downwind side of a doe bedding area and you're on the downwind side of a doe bedding area, how do you make sure that you're not between him and that bedding area so that he's also going to smell you? So talk about that, and maybe talk about fringe wind hunting, that type of thing. Just a little bit deeper dive on that for some people who aren't familiar with how to do that effectively.
Yeah. So one that is actually, so it depends on the type of habitat. In my experience there, oftentimes you're going to see that buck. It depends on the trail network system. Sometimes there's some doe bedding areas that I've hunted that there's big trails and little trails. So there's those big worn down trails that the does are just hammering, like, and the local deer herd bucks too just hammer. And then there's sometimes more obscure trails that are on the fringes of those. Sometimes those will be present, sometimes they won't. Sometimes you just have those big deer trails that run through there. Regardless, I'm going to make sure that I'm on the downwind side of all the trails that I am aware of, because more likely than not, those mature bucks, they tend to try to stay off, in my experience, tend to stay off of those really heavy trails unless that's the only option they have. If the terrain or the topography limit them from being able to do that, if the habitat limits them from being able to do that, if there's down trees, whatever it is. But if they can get downwind of those major trails and they're kind of more protected in that higher stem count area where maybe there's not as good of a trail, but they can still navigate through it. That's what I've seen. And so I try to stay as far within bow range, but as far away from the closest trail, even if it's an obscure trail, that I see. Now, if I've also seen, if it's just, say it's just a block, a square, we're just using this as an example, a square block of timber, and they're running across the south inside. I have seen some deer actually come across it out in the field edge, just right up against the timber. In that instance, it's a little harder because obviously you don't have any trees further behind you, more than likely. So how do you get downwind? Well, one thing that have seen is, if it's a property that you can manage and it's private, is setting up permanent box blinds or ground blinds and brushing them in that are, maybe if you're gun hunting, maybe 50 to 100 yards. If you're bow hunting, you don't want to get that far away. But I have seen success and seen others have success setting those ground blinds just off into the field, into the open. Maybe there's like a sinkhole that you can kind of get up next to, or an old tree stump that you can kind of blend in, whatever the case is. But I've seen some success there. If you can't do that, or if you don't like blinds, I do tend to get higher. If I'm right on the edge of that cover and I still think there's a chance that deer might get downwind of me by 5 yards, 10 yards, 15 yards, I tend to go higher in the tree. So if I'm up there around 25, like I like to be 15 to 20 feet, because that gives me the best opportunity as far as the deer anatomy goes to get a good ethical double lung hit. But if I'm in a situation where I think that I might get a deer that's 5-10 yards downwind of me, oftentimes I will try to go ahead and get a little higher, maybe 25 feet. At times I've done 30. I don't advise that, because that's can be a little hairy. But if that's what you do, that's what you do. So getting higher can sometimes help your scent cone. If you have good sustained winds, if it's a light to variable wind and your scent's kind of dropping, that won't work as well. But if you've got a day where it's a sustained 7, 8, 9 mile per hour day, then that scent's going to coast on over that deer's head, even if he is maybe 5-10 yards downwind. Is that good, or do we want to develop that some more?
No, that's good, man. And we have plenty of content on the field notes section of huntstand.com and in the Huntstand podcast to do a deeper dive. But that's just such a commonly referenced tactic, hunting the downwind side of doe bedding areas, that I figured it was worth a little bit deeper dive right here.
It's very cliche, and if you're not careful, you can get yourself in trouble as far as getting winded. And I have gotten winded trying to use this tactic, and so that's something that I have tried to fine tune. Is think about the situation. Okay, would it be better for a ground blind to get out in the field 50 yards if I'm crossbow hunting, or you want to be able to shoot into the timber, so you want that 10-20 yard window, buffer between the field edge into the timber, because you don't want to just be able to shoot the field edge in that situation. But if you can shoot the field edge and shoot a little bit into the timber as that deer skirts down that downwind side, maybe it's a blind, maybe it's that you climb higher in the tree right on the edge.
And you did, a lot of this we frame around archery hunting, because a lot of states, during the rut, there is no gun season, but states where there is a gun season during the rut, I mean, hey, cut your shooting lanes in advance if you can, if you're hunting on private ground, and get as far off that as you can, like you talked about, off that trail system on that downwind side with a rifle or a slug gun. And that's a fun all day sit, because you can expect some action.
Yeah. So the 3-day rut rule, I actually, there are times whenever I'm hunting during the rut where I am just absolutely loyal to that stand location, and there's times whenever I am going to be more mobile. But in my experience, if you know your property really well, if you're really in tune with how your deer herd uses the property, where the best, maybe 1, 2, or 3 best stand locations on that property are for the rut, whatever the phase of that rut is, whether it's one of the 5, again, we talked about 5 phases earlier, Mr. Murphy did. So the best stand location is going to be slightly different for each of those 5 phases. But whatever particular phase you're looking at here, if you know exactly where your best performing stand location is, I am a firm believer in investing 3 consecutive full day sits in that stand location. If you have a good deer herd that has a good age structure, you have a number of targets that you're considering shooting. So this isn't necessarily the best tactic for shooting one specific deer. Can be, but more so it's kind of attuned for targeting maybe the top 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 if you've got a lot, a high deer density bucks that you're going after. So if you're considering maybe shooting one of several deer, this is a really good tactic. Has performed for me a number of times. Again, giving a good rut stand at least 3 consecutive days, it might not kill a specific deer, But because, as we talked about earlier, that doe might be in estrus for 24 to 36 hours, and that buck might actually be with her for a little longer than that. And I'm going to talk about that here in a minute, but actually I'm going to talk about it now. So last year I was hunting and I sat in the tree stand. This was during our rifle season, and it broke daylight. And I looked 75 yards down, and there was a 3.5-year-old 8-pointer bedded with a doe. Stayed there all day long. They didn't leave a 10-yard radius except for when that buck fended off other bucks that, inferior bucks that were trying to move in. Left the stand that night. They hadn't moved. Came back the next morning, hunted the same spot. There they were again. They did not leave that same 20-yard radius all that day either. The doe never even got up except for whenever that buck was actually tending her, and then she would lay back down. So I know that those deer were laying there at least 36 hours. But then the third day I came back, that deer was up and moving again. I saw him down in the field. He wasn't right there. He was further away. I was in that CRP farm that has really good visibility, and I'm actually going to show you my final hunt on that farm from this past year. It was on Huntstand for people to view if they'd like to see the full hunt. We won't watch the whole thing, but I'll show you a few instances from it. But my point is with that deer is he didn't move, but eventually he started moving again. And so if you're hunting that same spot, you might not see a buck tending a doe, but if you hunt in your best stand location, eventually, whenever those bucks cut loose and start looking for another doe, they're going to cruise through whatever your best rut stand location is. And if you're targeting not just one, but maybe one of 3 or 4 different bucks, you're going to have a decent odds of seeing one of them. And that's been my experience in how I've killed several of my rut deer. Of course, wind direction impacts this. If the wind's going to be poor and changing frequently, you might not be able to sit the exact same spot, but you might be able to kind of shift around. Instead of this tree, you might be 100 yards that way or 75 yards this way, whatever the case might be. You might be able to still salvage that. But if you know the farm and you give your best rut stands 3 days, odds of seeing a mature buck are really good. Once you get into the late rut, and that's kind of toward the tail end of things. I'm not necessarily speaking about the second rut here, like whenever we're talking about when doe fawns start entering estrus, but it's more so the latter stages of the primary rut. The primary food sources are still good. Secondary food sources are good. I actually tend to start shifting more toward those more secondary food sources at that point. They are generally the primary food sources. If you're hunting pressured ground or if you've pressured your own ground, those secondary food sources that maybe haven't received as much hunting pressure tend to start seeing more activity. And so I kind of start slinking back toward those if those are attractive food sources at that time, obviously. Staging area is really good. Those are basically going to look different every single time, but it ultimately the definition of that is a location between bedding areas and food sources, those lines of movement where deer kind of hold up before and after daylight. So if it's a morning hunt, you might see those deer staging up on maybe they were feeding on cut corn out in the field, and they come in, they start feeding on some oaks, some red oaks or some white oaks that are left over, and then they go off to bed. In the afternoon, same thing. Maybe they come in and they stage up on those oaks before they go back out to corn. So staging areas can be really good because deer tend to start spending a little bit more time, in my experience, back into the cover once you get later in that rut. So those staging areas, those secondary food sources can be really good. Doe bedding with solar and thermal cover. If you're hunting an area with an extended rut, maybe it's in the south or it's not so much a factor in the south in my experience, but if you're hunting in an area where it's just getting really cold and it's still the rut and these deer are needing some help combating that, solar and thermal cover becomes more important as it gets later into the fall and winter. So whereas it might not be as big of a factor in late October, early November, whenever it's a little bit warmer, once you get into mid-November or late November or early December, that solar or thermal cover that maybe went overlooked or unutilized by the deer herd or the bulk of the deer herd might suddenly become more viable. And then rut sign close to buck bedding. As these does become more of them become bred and there's less and less receptive ones on the landscape, bucks tend to start slinking back into their old habits, those bed to feed movements. So as you start to see those scrapes open back up in the late rut, that means that those bucks might be having fewer does to be receptive, and they might start easing back in to their old ways. Obviously, you want to make sure your tactics are focusing on current situations, such as you want to make sure that the bedding areas are things that are working for them now for the various reasons: security, thermal cover, solar cover, hunting pressure, whatever the case is. But you also want to be thinking about really unpressured areas. That's where it all boils down to by the late rut, because everybody has been out in the woods. So find those overlooked, unpressured areas of really good deer habitat, and you might just shoot a late rut buck. Unorthodox options, we've already talked about these, so I'm not going to rehash them, but weird tactics or tactics that aren't as common, don't get used as much. Hunting those weird spots that bucks push estrus does to, definitely remember that. I'm not saying that you necessarily want to hunt those every time, but if you know of a place like that in your mind, like, oh man, there's that sinkhole that I've seen several bucks push does to in the past. What's up with that? Keep that in mind, because that's something to remember. Stalking with a decoy, don't do that on public land. I know some people do, but don't do it on public land. That's my safety advice. Don't do it on areas where you're hunting with a lot of other people. But if you're hunting an area where you have sole access, stalking with a decoy can work, especially if it's a 2D decoy, such as like something that you can kind of hold while you got your bow and the decoy, and you can kind of creep close. That can sometimes get you within gun range, especially, but maybe even bow range. I don't like to do that during gun season though, so I do not advise that either. I really only like to stalk with a decoy during bow season, because you don't want another hunter mistaking you as a deer stalking with a deer decoy during gun season. So I don't advise for that. But even if you think you're the only person on the property, sometimes you're not. So mobile hanging hunts. We talked earlier about the 3-day rut rule. I am going to develop this a little bit further. The only time I pull off of that 3-day rut rule is if I see something immediate and real time that urges me to do something different. So like maybe you see a deer, you know a deer, you saw your target buck, he ran across the woods, he's 500 yards away, he went into that wood lot up there. He's not coming back to your wood lot more than likely. Get down and move. And that's actually what I did in this hunt that I'm fixing to show you here in a moment. I am loyal to that 3-day rut rule name that I give it, whatever, the tactic. But if you have reason to maybe make a shift, maybe you see a lot of bucks cruising the same areas, 2 or 3, 4 bucks, 5 bucks, whatever, cruising the same trail, or just the deer herd in general. If you've seen a lot of does, especially if you've seen a doe that, again, we talked about the signs earlier, looks like she's an estrus, and you see that she went down a trail that's out of range and it's leading away from you, I would get down and go rehang down on that particular location. And then still hunting is a really good tactic, even during the rut. I think it was the largest deer in Kentucky this past season, largest typical, was killed by a still hunter. So it can be viable even during the rut, because the deer are just more distracted during this time frame. This is a situational scenario that we're looking at here. This is just a map of a general property. So I have marked some places here that look kind of interesting to me. I have not hunted this property, but this looks interesting to me, some of these stand locations, for various reasons. So this right here, this is a creek. It snakes down through here, snakes backing around. But it comes up through here. And I love shallow creeks for access. If I can get into a creek and then get maybe up on that creek bank, or if it's a really, really shallow river, maybe you can do the same. Obviously, you don't want to be doing that in dangerous situations where the water's too deep. Starting here at the top, I like this stand location for like maybe a north wind, where because you got a stretch here where it's just a straight north to south. You can come in somewhere, hit that creek, come up to that stand location, and then you got a wind that's blowing. And this is the key for me a lot of times. Have your wind direction, your wind cone scent going in the same direction as your foot scent. Of course, if you're walking through that water, you're not going to have any ground scent. And that's the beautiful thing about that situation there. But having your wind scent and your ground scent in the same direction, that's going to basically make it to where the deer only smells you from one direction. Whereas if you're coming in this way and your wind's blowing this way, you've got a much bigger window of opportunity there to spook deer. So I like that stand location, because if you got a north wind, you might have bucks that are cruising this edge. Maybe you got a west wind and those bucks are cruising around that rim, and then boom, they come down there and you get a shot at him right there. You're maybe 5 yards off that river and you get him right there as he's trying to go south. I like that spot. When you're looking here, same thing. If you got like this right here, looks like it's really thick bedding cover. So if you're in that stand right there, just on the north side of that creek, there might be, it looks like, again, looks like really heavy cover. Some of it's blocked up here by this line. We tried not to give away any markers around identification here, but that looks really thick to me. And that might be a good, one of those weird spots where those bucks are pushing those does to try to get them away, or it just might be a general bedding area too. So if you got a stand location that's right there on the north side of that creek, and you got a north wind, you might catch something working through there. This area I like for a different reason. You've got a lot of connectivity, and this is flat ground. It looks like flat ground. I mean, it's probably got some terrain change, but it's not like the hills of Ohio, put it that way, or New York or Pennsylvania. So when you don't have topography to help you out, you've got to get habitat to help you out. And you've got a lot of connectivity here. So you got deer that's coming from this way, maybe this way, maybe this way, maybe this way. And if you set up right here on the edge of that creek, excuse me, or wherever you've got that trail, the key thing here is the trail intersection. If you set up on the downwind side of that trail intersection for whatever wind direction you're playing for, you've got deer coming from multiple directions right there. Right here, this would be an ideal situation. Say this is cornfield here. You know, you got a lot of deer bedding up here and they're working that cornfield, and you got a north wind blowing back through here. It's kind of dropping off low elevation down here. So your scent's kind of carrying, your afternoon thermals are pushing down into this low line area. And the most of the deer coming up from here, coming south. Decoys can be great right there. So if you got some good visibility and you're not worried about the deer getting downwind of you, they're coming out of that bedding area. Maybe he comes out up here and he's not in bow range. That can be great. Again, this spot down here, connectivity, that's what we're looking at. Pinch points, funnels. This area down here, I'm thinking probably gun stand, not so much bow stand, unless you're using a decoy, depending on your wind direction. This right here is kind of like a little, looks like a little ridge line where these deer might be cruising through with the right wind direction. You might have a mature buck that comes through that timber right there, scent checking down below on the bottom, or scent checking up in the top, depending on the wind. But if you've got like a decoy that's right down here in this corner, maybe this corner, and he's cruising that ridge and you see him coming, he's probably out of bow range, but you can grunt at him if you don't see that decoy. And if he does see the decoy, he might commit on his own. This down in here, you know, a lot of the times you get northerly winds, and these deer are still going to be bedding with the wind in their favor. So you got, looks like you got maybe, it's kind of running northeast to southwest, but more, long story short, it's kind of like looks like a little point, and these deer are probably going to be bedded down on that point. So if you got like a wind direction that's blowing north to south, that's where they're going to be bedding at more than likely, because they like to bed with the wind at their back, even during the rut. So if you can try to find, and I'm not saying this is your exact location, but like somewhere down in here to kind of take advantage of these deer that you know are bedded right there and they're coming back this way to feed. Maybe you get over here depending on the wind. Maybe if it's a little bit off, you know, maybe if it's a northeast wind, maybe you get over here. That way it's coasting this way, it's just off. If it's a westerly, you get over here where it's coasting just off, whatever. But definitely look at that. Up here, I like this again for just a general food source stand, or maybe it's again a decoy situation. Same thing here. And then I zoomed in on this map. There's actually a little water hole right there, and I love water during the rut. So if you got a south wind and that's blowing way back up in here where you don't expect any deer, and you got maybe a buck that's thirsty and he's running through, he stops in that water hole and you put him on the wall. I like that spot. Looking here, this is hills. So it's not mountains, but it's hills. So this is a situation whereas before we were looking at a lot of habitat-based stuff and terrain, bedding areas and food sources in relation to how the habitat is distributed. Here we're looking more so at topography. This right here, as you can see, is kind of it's a point-ish. It's not a great point, but it's kind of a point where it's kind of easterly. And so a lot of times you got a west wind, you know, you're going to have deer bedding up on this point down here. Maybe if you can get down here, there's you know, there's going to be a bench that runs right around through here somewhere. You can find it. There's almost always benches that run around these ridges. And so if you can find a bench that works, you know, along those downwind sides ridges or goes around those points, and you can get in there clean with good access, that's great. Another one here, this point right here, that can be good. Maybe, these deer are coming down off this ridge, it's that just looks like a scrape line right there, but it's not, you're not necessarily hunting for the scrapes. But it's just one of those situations where, you might catch deer on either side of that ridge right there running in this area. Looking for does, because this looks really thick down in here. So you're probably going to have a lot of does bedding down in here, bedding down in here, bedding over in here maybe. And a lot of times, like I said, of a morning, these bucks are running these high level benches, trying to smell what's down below. This right here is pretty cool too, because you got this ridge system that runs down through here and it tapers off down into this lower level, really thick early successional cover. And it drops off steep right there. Not super steep, but pretty steep. And it looks to me like that's a downwind blocker. So if you stand right there on that downwind side with a west wind and it's coasting down in here, those bucks are going to cruise right through there and never know you're there. I like this stand location over here for decoying. You got a little field right here. Maybe, you got these ridges that run through here, maybe a bench that runs through here, and then you got this stand location right there and a decoy right out here, and then you're all good. But we're going to move on. We've got stuff to do here. I think we're going to skip this slide. I'm not going to film it or show this whole hunt, but there's some stuff here. We're going to skip through the intro.
Kentucky.
And
gun season. Let's go.
Yeah, so this was the deer that I shot. He's actually right there.
I was walking.
I'm going to turn the volume down on that real quick, but y'all don't need to hear me both ways. So what's going on here is that particular deer is on that CRP farm. And this was the first day. I actually passed the deer. I was hunting a different deer, so I let him walk this day. But I watched him breed 2 different does over the course of our gun season here in Kentucky. And this was the first encounter I had with him. Didn't shoot him you can see the property a little better here. This was the day I actually shot the deer. You can see how that property's in CRP. I'm skipping around here. I don't want to show you the whole hunt because you can go find it on Huntstand. But long story short, whenever it was midday here, I saw this deer down in an area. I was actually doing like an all day sit, but I was moving to a different location. And I looked up, saw this deer, and he wasn't where I thought he was. But because it was rifle season, because I have a lot of stands on this property, I was able to sneak and climb up into a stand location that was about 120, 130 yards from where this buck was bedded down with an estrus doe. And so I was able to get in range. And of course, we got a bunch of more footage where I'm explaining the situation. We don't want that. That's a deer that came into range. It's a CRP. They're bedded down. Let's skip ahead. Whoop, maybe I skipped too far. There it is. Yeah. So you can see he's bedded down with that doe right there. As I was talking earlier, they really like to bed down in this CRP to get them away from other bucks. I did not see this deer have to fend off any bucks this day. The first encounter he did, he had to fend off a couple. But this particular time, he didn't have to. All day, all afternoon long from the time I saw him at lunch. And he finally stood up and got a shot. But that is what it is. Camera's not great, can't help that. But if you want to see the full hunt, you can see more there. I'm not going to bore you with it because we're getting pretty late on time here. Rut hunting lessons. Again, the October lull is not real. Brian Murphy talked about a lot of that. I'm going to skip it. The rut is honestly not a great time to hunt specific target bucks, but it can be a great time to hunt just the general herd. Bucks in their fall rut range, a buck's fall rut range is likely different than its spring, summer, or winter range in my experience, or at least slightly different, using slightly different parts of his home range. And so I guess I shouldn't say it's a different home range, but he's in different parts of his home range. Warm weather does not stop the rut from happening. Maybe it limits some of the daylight action, but it's not going to stop deer from breeding. Water is especially important. New deer can show up frequently. We talked about that. Bucks push estrus does to weird places. Rut action is very localized in some instances. So you might have some really awesome stuff going on this property, and then you go a mile down the road and it just feels dead. And it's not because the rut's different this property to the next, it's just because those are a little bit staggered or whatever, or the deer might be a little ways off. Every buck has its own personality. We've talked about that. Mornings for me have tended to be a little bit better, but afternoons are good too. Midday's really good. And then terrain is really important. Terrain and topography based hotspots that you can find that are good for hunting. Use those hunt stand layers to find both of those. And then rut hunting mistakes to avoid. Thinking that peak rut is prime, it's not the best time. It's actually that 7 to 10 day period leading up to that. Focusing on the wrong bedding areas at the wrong time, don't do that. Focusing on the wrong food sources at the wrong time, don't do that. Food sources kind of vary and stagger as far as their peak attractiveness goes. Focusing on specific target bucks can be very difficult during the rut. You can do it if you want, but it's been pretty tough for me. Ignoring oddball spots, stuff like that. Yeah, just be careful. I'm not going to read through all these. All of these are stuff that we've already talked about, so I'm going to move it on. I'll turn it back over to Mr. Dockey.
Thanks, man. That was a lot of awesome information, and we still got hundreds of people here who have stuck around. So to reward those who have stuck around, we really appreciate it. Thank you for tuning into this thing, and hopefully you learned something tonight. We are giving away this prize package that you see right here from Stealth Cam, Muddy, and Buck Bomb to 5 lucky winners. And those winners are Jeff Moore, Andy Folk, Rob Ranger, Laura Marks, and Zeke Shipman. So we will be following up with you with an email. We're going to ship this stuff out as soon as we possibly can, either this week or early next week. So you will still have it, hopefully, to take advantage of some rut hunting action like we've talked about here tonight. Now we're going to cut into the Q&A session, which we're actually going to start with just a couple of the questions that came in. Let's see here, during the event. So if I can just dig these up real quick. All right. You know what? Actually, we're going to go right to some of the questions that were submitted before the event while I find some of the live Q&A questions. So first one's for Mr. Honeycutt. And I'll have both Brian and Josh pop back on video mode with some audio here so we can even just, if you want to weigh in on some of these, whether it's for one of you guys or the other, feel free to just drop in and have some comments. But we got Richard C. from South Carolina. Do attractants work, and what is the best way to deploy them? Now, that is something that we did not cover in this. We didn't talk about attractants. We didn't talk about mock scrapes. And actually, next to calling techniques, the most common question that we got out of the hundreds of questions that were submitted during the registration process were related to using scents and attractants. And
Mr. Murphy?
Yeah, I'll kick this over to either of you guys.
Well, I'm happy to comment my personal sort of thoughts on the subject. I actually did my graduate research on scent communication in whitetails, looking at what are the chemical signals that bucks receive that tell a doe's in estrus. And, the preponderance of data that I and many other students collected and others at the University of Georgia would suggest that the doe is emanating this scent from her whole body. In other words, her reproductive tract is the primary source of this magical pheromone that fills the air that bucks cue in on. And I think the answer to scent, the use of scents is a yes, no, and sometimes kind of scenario. I personally have used scent successfully and had deer, scent trail drag that I created. I've had some react negatively. I've had, use of things like, hands off bucks that I've harvested actually work quite well, particularly when other bucks in the area smelling the tarsal gland of another buck is certainly something that can be quite effective. What I found perhaps most useful when using scents, and primarily day in and day out, I typically don't use a lot of scents. I like to not alert the deer to any evidence of anything around them that may be different than what they're used to. But where I have used scents quite successfully, particularly bow hunting, is to put them on the opposite side of a trail that is a likely travel route for a deer that I'm after. And so as the deer is walking down the trail, say left to right, in front of me, instead of putting on my side of the trail closest to me, I put it just literally a couple of feet on the other side of the trail so that it forces the deer to turn its head away from me, and I can get an easy, quartering away bow shot. It takes the deer's eyes off me long enough to get a draw and make an ethical shot. So that's where I've used scents most successfully. But again, day in and day out, I'm kind of a purist when it comes to scent, and I don't use a whole lot of it. Where I do, I try to use it very strategically. And as Josh Honeycutt talked about earlier, using it on a decoy would be an obvious, I think an obvious plus. So there's certainly some situations where scents can be effective. Sometimes they, certainly I've experienced some negative results in some circumstances, but some positive ones as well. So it's kind of a hit and miss scenario depending on the context of the situation, in my experience.
All right, good deal. The next question, we will actually cut over to Honeycutt, since you just answered that one. This is from Ian S. from New Jersey. Are you better off running and gunning or sticking to stands that have a history of success during the rut? And I know you covered some of this, but we'll just breeze over it again here.
Yeah, I think sticking to your proven rut stand locations, maybe you've had some success there in the years, is really important. Nobody knows your hunting property better than you. And so if you know spots that have produced in the past, then I'd stick with them. And maybe you give them that 3 days, 2 days, whatever you can give them. And then if you see a reason to make a change, like we talked about, maybe head on down and hit that new spot. If you see some deer cruising through, or if you see an estrus doe run into a woodlot, or whatever the case might be.
Cool. This next one is from Mikkel M from Florida, and it's a pretty specific question in terms of regionality. Is the rut in South Florida as predictable as up north? And the reason I selected this one to be answered is because I think it applies to anybody who might have that question from any part of the country. And Brian, you can answer that.
I think the answer is it depends. And that's always a good biologist response, but obviously it depends where you are in South Florida. And if you're able to, if you have pro whitetail, you can actually zoom in and see all the different variation in rut dates in South Florida. And if you look between, Tampa and, that Tampa area, for example, they have the earliest rut in the country, and not far from that, they have some of the latest rut dates, and it changes pretty quickly across even parts of counties. So what I would suggest you do is go to our rut map, determine where you're hunting. And if you're in a pretty big band, a pretty big zone of a consistent set of rut dates, in other words, there's not rapid change near you, I would say it's fairly predictable, because the data that we receive from the state of Florida, their biologists have done some really good work, probably among the best of any states that I've worked with in terms of really modeling their rut dates, because they have so much variation. So they've collected a lot of really good data. So I would say, go to your area, look on the whitetail rut map. If you're in a pretty big band around you of the same set of rut dates, whatever those are, I would say, yeah, it's very reliable. However, if you're in a transition area where literally, a few miles one way or the other could change your rut dates by a couple of weeks or heck, a month or more in some cases, then I would say that would be less reliable. But in general, where you have a lot of variation, it's going to be a little less reliable than when it's pretty well consistent as it is across the northern half of the U.S.
All right, going back to Honeycutt, Thomas M from Pennsylvania. What location is better for hunting during the rut? A primary scrape that's used all year, or a downwind of a bedding area?
100% bedding area. In my experience, I don't see much scrape. I will see bucks scrape during the rut, but usually it's more of a convenience thing than a planned thing. Like if a buck knows where he's wanting to go and he's going from point A to B, and there happens to be a scrape along that line of movement, he will stop and visit that scrape, in my experience. But so I would almost take scrapes as if you can get it, like maybe you got a scrape on the downwind side of a doe bedding area and you want to camp out over that to maybe stop that deer for a shot opportunity, maybe so. But I would, if you got to choose one or the other and they're well away from each other, I would definitely take the downwind side of the doe bedding area.
Yeah, and most likely you're going to find a few scrapes on the downwind side of a doe bedding area, so you could get the best of both worlds. Next one's for back to Murphy. And this one's going to be a big one, I think, for a lot of people. Are bucks still primarily nocturnal during the rut? That's Steve L. from Minnesota.
Yeah, well, I think the bigger picture is to look at deer movement during daylight hours period throughout the year. And a good friend of mine, Dr. Mickey Hellickson, did a landmark study some years ago where he had radio collars on 43 mature bucks, radio transmitters, and collected over 500,000 data points. And what he found was pretty interesting, and that is that about 60% of the time, bucks are not doing anything. They're just bedded up, doing their thing. They're loafing. So only about 40% of a 24-hour period on an annual basis does a buck even move. And then when you look at when they move, the peak movement times throughout the year are early morning, late evening. So obviously, as hunters, we kind of know that deer are considered crepuscular. That just means they move more early morning, late evening. So, but if only 40% of the day they're moving at all, and most of that is in low light hours at morning and right on dark, it's not surprising that we don't see a lot of daytime movement of bucks. However, Mickey's research did show that daylight activity of bucks peaks during the pre-rut period. So it does decline a little bit during the rut. This is daytime movement. It declines a little bit during the peak of breeding because, as we talked about earlier, often these bucks are with does. They're in heavy cover and they're not moving a lot. So I would say, yes, they do become slightly more nocturnal during the rut, but primarily because they've got does hemmed up. But in general, deer don't spend a lot of their movement period at 40% in daylight hours anyway, throughout any time of the year. So deer are creatures of low light and darkness more than they are daytime in general, if you look at their annual and daily movements. So I would say, yes, slightly more nocturnal, but they're certainly not nocturnal during the rut because of hunters. It's because of their doe guarding behavior primarily.
Right on. Back to Honeycutt. You sort of covered this, but best places to set up in the morning versus afternoons during the rut, and best times to enter the woods for each. This is David M. from New York.
In my opinion, that's no different than any other time of the year. Say you can only do a morning hunt. Generally, I like to get closer to those bedding areas and further away from food of a morning during the rut, just like any other time of the year, simply because those does are on similar movement patterns as they are all season long. It's the bucks that are really seeming to change their behavior, in my experience. So unless it's an estrus doe, obviously. But so yeah, of a morning hunt, I would definitely focus more on cover. Afternoon hunts, if you're coming in at lunchtime, I would get closer to food, because you're gonna, if you're trying to bust through a bunch of heavy cover at lunchtime, you run a high risk of spooking bedded deer. So in morning hunts, try to get into that, get on the downwind side or just into the edge of that bedding area, maybe 2 hours before daylight, hour and a half at the latest before daylight, maybe 3 hours before daylight, depending on the situation, and how far away that food is from the bed. That it's situational tactics there. But afternoons, I would probably get further away from the bedding areas. The safest play in a lot of ways is to hunt transition routes between the two. And again, those can be connected areas between doe bedding areas. Maybe it's staging areas that the bucks and the does, whatever the case is. But yeah, I would be cognizant and aware of where those deer are when you're walking in and when you're walking out. That entry and exit factor is just as important during the rut as it is any other time of the season.
And Josh, I think that answers one of the other questions that was posed, and that is basically from Robert V., Wisconsin. Should I worry about overhunting a stand before the rut starts? Impact always matters, but I would also argue that, you could overhunt a stand before the rut, but once it kicks in, a few things do go out the window, and you're probably gonna, have some activity around that stand.
In my opinion, overhunting is all in relation to your access. If you've got dynamite access, you can come in and hunt the same stand with the right wind direction. You can come in and hunt the same stand location 20 times in a row. And if you've got good in and out, they're not going to know you're there. If you've got poor access, though, you might only get in and out one time before you know they're there. So in my experience, when it comes to overhunting, now I do like to save my best rut stands for the rut and leave the pressure off those deer. So if I know that particular area or property peaks during the rut, then I oftentimes don't hunt it a lot during the early season or pre-rut. But again, as far as the overhunting and burning out stands go, in my experience, it's all comes down to your access and the quality of it.
So Brian, I know that you came here primarily tonight to talk some relationship advice. So we've got Ashley W. from Georgia, And she wants to know, how can I sound intelligent when I go hunting with my fiance?
That's a great question. I think the first thing to do is exactly what you're doing tonight, and that is to try to, listen to good content that's got a sound basis in science and not a lot of conjecture to it, which is what we've tried to provide tonight, both experientially with Honeycutt's many days of field each year and some of the research that I've been involved with over, almost 40 years. So the first thing is to just get engaged with good content. Look at reputable sources like Huntstand, like National Deer Association, groups that put out good content. Second is to keep an open mind and ask good questions. Obviously, don't be timid to ask, why we came in this way, why we're hunting here, how old is that deer out there? Why are you not shooting that one, but this one? Ask good questions. And don't be overwhelmed initially by a lot of lingo that hardcore hunters often use. I mean, we throw around, lingo like CRP, like everybody knows what that is, Conservation Reserve Program, G2 tines, and this, that, and the other. And we throw a lot of lingo out there, and it is a specialized language that hardcore whitetail hunters use, and it does take some time to pick it up. But I think just more than anything, just keep your eyes and your ears open and ask good questions. And then also, again, seek good advice from reputable sources.
Thank you, Dr. Phil. Back to Honeycutt. We got Tim N from South Carolina, and I think this is a good question. And I think I'll lead you into it a little bit, but I think it might have something to relate to thermals. We always read stories about hunting in hills and valleys, but what about hunting in lowlands and along flatter, swampy areas? What do you think about that?
Yeah, as far as thermals go, thermals are a factor everywhere. It's just when you have steeper terrain, thermals tend to be more pronounced. So of a morning, if you're hunting flat ground, thermals can still be a factor, because when that temperature starts to rise, I still see those updrafts for that first early part of the day. And then likewise, if you're hunting flat ground of an afternoon and you're hunting really close to maybe not so much swamp ground where there's water everywhere, but if it's the whole area is not flooded, but you're in a swampy area and maybe you've got like a creek that's right behind you, afternoon, as long as the prevailing winds aren't overpowering the thermals, your afternoon thermals are going to sink downward, and the water is actually going to pull that thermal scent down into that water source. And that's why I'm such an advocate for hunting over water, or not over water, but right on the edge of water. So like right on the edge of a creek bank, or right on the edge of a pond, or right on the edge of whatever it is. Because in the afternoons, in the mornings, you've got your thermals are going up, but in the afternoons, your thermals are going to go down, and they're going to go straight to where that water is. The lowest lying areas in the afternoon is where your scent congregates to. But water, as long as you don't have winds that are over 2-3 miles per hour, if it's calm or dead calm, it's going to collect on that water source.
Brian, this one, if you can answer this, I'm probably going to quit my job and just hunt the rest of the year as many states as I can during the rut. And this is from Tyler T from Kentucky. It's actually a really good question. I'm just being a little bit sarcastic, but how can you get a buck away from a hot doe?
Wow, that's about as tough a question as it gets, because it's a very difficult thing to do. And in fact, it's ironic that you're from Kentucky. I was actually last November 21st. I remember the day well. I was hunting in one of my favorite spots in Western Kentucky, and I had a hot doe come out on a little food plot I was on. And over the course of that morning, I saw 10 racked bucks, 9 of which were 2.5 and older, and 2 of which were really top end mature deer that I was more than happy to take if they got into bow range. And they hung up with that hot doe out in that field at 60 yards. And I tried everything I knew. I threw grunts and bleats and grunt snort wheezes at them, and I couldn't get those bucks to come off of her. I did wonder if had I had a decoy, could I have perhaps gotten enough aggression out of one of those 2 bucks, because one of them was definitely more dominant than the other, and the other one was kind of hanging just around the periphery, still out of bow range. But I wonder if I could have at least gotten one of those 2 bucks to come off of her if I had a buck that was, a sizable enough decoy that would have challenged him, because I did grunt snort wheeze at him. I called him every name in the book, and he didn't bite on that. So other than trying to get an aggressive response out of the buck to come and whip another buck, I don't think you're going to have much luck getting them off of them. I don't know anybody that's consistently been able to do it And once they got what they're looking for, they're hard to get off of them, off a hot doe.
This one's for Honeycutt. I'm hoping you can answer this. Otherwise, Brian could weigh in as well. I know that two of the most intimidating places that you can hunt whitetails would be in big woods, hardwoods, and pine plantations, or just giant pine stands. So Andre T from Louisiana asks, what is the best way to target bucks in pine woods?
Yeah, to your point on big woods, homogeneous timber is incredibly difficult to hunt. The deer still live there, but they're not as dense, and it's hard to figure it out. It takes time. But as far as the pine woods go, pine trees, I don't like to hunt right in the middle of those pines. I try to find where there's edge cover. So where do those pine trees meet hardwoods? Where does it meet some early successional habitat? Deer are edge creatures. Now they'll spend time deep in those pines. Brian's further south than I am, so he'll be able to speak to this better than me because I don't hunt a lot of pines. I haven't since I lived in South Carolina. But in my experience, whenever I was hunting those pines, I was focused on that edge cover where either the pines were meeting the hardwoods or the pines were meeting really early successional habitat.
Yeah, I'll weigh in on that just a little bit. Coming from the deep south, I've done most of my hunting in the deep south, in a lot of pine stands throughout the south. And this is certainly no disrespect to my Midwest brothers and sisters who hunt the sort of agricultural Midwest, but I'll challenge any hunter to come to 1,000 acres of planted pines and find so-called pinch points and some of the obvious terrain features that we can readily identify on the map. And the same would hold true if you hunt the big woods of the Northeast, just as challenging. So I would argue that you have to be even more savvy as a whitetail hunter to find those subtle terrain changes, the subtle benches, and really look at topography, because a lot of these tracks are fairly flat. So you have to look very closely, and HuntStand's a great tool for that. As Honeycutt pointed out, if you do have some edge transition between habitat types, and sometimes they're literally changes in timber stand age. They're still pine stands, but you may have one stand that's 17-year-old pines and one that's 8-year-old pines or 30-year-old pines. So if you have the ability, if the landowner has a forest stand map that shows you the different age classes of the timber, you can look at where those different age classes collide and look along those lines. Often you get some increased sunlight, particularly if there's been a thinning. We often do a third row thinning them at certain ages of pines in the south. You have some natural sort of daylight there, and you're gonna have a little better vegetation, some better habitat quality. So again, you have to be a lot more sort of subtle in your approach when trying to separate these big pine or hardwood stands, and look at some more subtle features than you would in the agricultural Midwest, or in some of these more ag dominated or sort of bifurcated landscapes where you have a lot of very different habitats that are very easy to identify.
All right. Well, we are well over 2 hours into this Rut Riot Hunt class, and I just want to say thank you to everybody who has stuck around. We're very humbled that there are still over 200 people who have stuck around and are still here right now. So we're gonna have one more question, and it's kind of self-serving because I'm actually quite interested in the answer myself, and this is also going to go to Mr. Brian Murphy, and that is from Gary B., South Carolina. Is there a doe breeding pecking order? That's actually a question I've never heard asked or addressed. So I'll leave it to you, Brian, to finish the class.
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's a little bit of sort of data on that subject in a couple of different ways. The fact is that within a doe family group, there's an established hierarchy. So the family group in whitetails is a matriarchal doe and her female offspring. So if you see a group of antlerless deer out there, there's clearly going to be one who's kind of the old nanny wise gal of the group. When it comes to fawning, she clearly has there's a pecking order when it comes to fawning territory. So the most high-ranking doe within a family group will get the first choice of a fawning area, and it'll go down the line from there. Now, the fact is that in a given 2 or 3 day period, you're not going to have, in most cases, you're not going to have several of the same family group does come into heat on the same day. Just it may happen over a 2-week period, but it probably isn't going to happen on a single day. So generally it's not a pecking order when it comes to that. But what we do find is that as a doe enters estrus, she often will separate herself from her family group maybe because she's getting chased by bucks that are starting to pick up on the fact that she's entering estrus, but typically they're by themselves. What we have found, and Mississippi State did some great research on this, is that does do, it's not just bucks chasing does. Does will actually increase their activity looking for bucks during that receptive period. So it's not just bucks looking for does. Does will actually look for bucks. And the research at Mississippi State showed that size does matter when it comes to buck antler size, that does, when given a chance, will select a larger antlered buck over a smaller antlered buck if there's a choice. And that makes sense. You know, they're wanting to breed with the most dominant, largest males because that is their best chance of producing viable offspring, you know, that will carry on for generations to come. So not really a clear pecking order when it comes to who breeds first, because again, they're typically not going to be with other does that are also cycling. They're going to be by themselves. But there is a pecking order at fawning time, and certainly a decision process that the doe themselves have some say in. It's not just the bucks.
Good deal. Well, all right, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this hunt class presented by Huntstand. Special thanks to our guests, Josh Honeycutt and Brian Murphy. If you don't have it already, please get yourself a Pro Whitetail membership from Huntstand. You won't regret it. And check us out at huntstand.com and all the social media channels. You'll find us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok. Download the Huntstand podcast, subscribe, all those great things, and we will see you the next time around. Thanks for joining us tonight. See you later.
Good luck hunting, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Good luck.